Some time ago, I said to a friend, half as a joke, that through no fault of its own, Harry Potter was about 70 to 80% responsible for the degradation of modern literature. It would be more accurate to say that fan fiction is 80 to 90% responsible for the degradation of modern literature. And that statement is something I stand by. Before you get all fired up and start filling the comment section with angry remarks about how it's, not all fan fiction, I don't really care.
Saying a book is like fan fiction is a pretty common insult. Saying modern publishing is defined by fanfiction culture isn't too unreasonable. But painting all fanfiction by the cheesiest, goofiest examples is not only wrong, but also possibly malicious.
Hi, my name is Ebony Darkness Dementia Raven Way.
To paint all publishing in the world with those same standards is downright idiotic.
At some point, this was probably the early 2010s, I, naive, foolish, innocent, ventured onto AO3, that is Archive of Our Own, the main online fanfiction hub for the last, 15 years or so, to see what there was to see.
Fanfiction writing is the process of a writer creating a story set in an already established continuity that they themselves don't own.
I'm sitting in a laundromat reading about myself, sitting in a laundromat reading about myself. My head hurts.
There's gonna be something this guy's not telling us.
In other words, transformative fiction. This distinction is of course important. It's what people who love the Star Wars Legend canon tell themselves to pretend that no, the Thrawn trilogy isn't just really good fanfiction, it's real. But also, it's not enough for the Divine Comedy defenders to argue that no, Dante Aligheri wasn't writing fanfiction when he decided to set himself into a world where he got to hang out with his favorite authors and mythological figures or anything like that. Or John Milton was writing fanfiction when he wrote Paradise Lost and set Satan as this just misunderstood handsome guy who liked turning into snakes. The modern practice of fanfiction writing owes itself to, like all modern fandoms, Star Trek, where fans, mostly women, would write stories in self-published zines. In Japan, the trend of doujinshi emerged, self-published comics based on the worlds of popular anime and manga. Some major manga creators got their start working with doujin, such as Clamp.
I am referring, of course, to Clamp's 2 JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stardust Crusaders doujins, in which Dio uses the world to eat Jotaro's breakfast and Kakyoin lays an egg.
He just lays an egg, that happens. There's also a series of Sailor Moon doujin known as A-Zone. Well, it's more than just Sailor Moon, but Sailor Moon is the most popular part of it, written by Azuma Kiyohiko, who would go on to create Azumanga Daioh and Yotsuba, some of the most popular manga around. It seems strange to me how in manga, doujin are just an accepted part of fandom culture. Your favorite creator probably got their start working on doujin. Usually, explicit doujin. See Kota Hirano, the creator of Hellsing, whose work before Hellsing was essentially a collection of just explicit doujin. That's how I know for a fact that Hellsing is just his collection of fetishes. He really loves glasses, gloves, and guns. And I'm bringing this up because recently there's been a deluge of anti-fanfiction propaganda acting like modern writing is fallen merely because some fanfiction writers got publishing deals. This of course ignores the decade-spanning international history of fanfiction and writing, because what good is a bad video essay on YouTube without a few historical omissions, right? Am I right? Enter Second Story, the YouTube account of author Hilary Layne. Layne's whole channel is built on the premise that modern writing has somehow fallen from grace in relation to the great classics of old, and in her recent video titled Fanfiction Has Destroyed Writing and Everything Else, apt title I guess, she claims that fanfiction has destroyed everything in the world. Everything is fanfiction's fault. Now, this is not my first time responding to her, as I thought her video on modern villainy was highly reductive and anchored in excessively shoddy research. However, I think she's outdone herself.
In recent years, despite any outlying works of alleged genius, and they are outlying and not the norm, fanfiction has developed a manifestly particular kind of image and reputation. The aesthetics of fanfiction, if you'll allow me, have become a very specific sort. And that image and those aesthetics have broken internet containment and entered mainstream literature and storytelling.
I think Layne has completely failed to understand fan culture, fan writing, and indeed the art of publishing itself. I want to give a shout out though early on to a different creator, Sarah Zed. She and her co-writer, Lady Emily, put together a video a couple years back on the history of fanfiction.
In response to fanfiction's rise in popularity, there's been this sort of schism among its readers and the wider world of literature culture. This backlash against fanfiction not just as a lesser form of art, but something that's not even art at all, with some even arguing that its existence has worsened culture, our understanding of literature, our skills as readers and writers, and even our capitalistic society. Much like The Fountain, there's an entire group of people arguing over the artistic merits of fanfiction, wondering if something made entirely through transformation that may lack the intricacies of traditional lit and traditionally published books deserves to actually be considered art or even worth reading.
This is one of my sources for this video. I'm citing others in the description below because unlike Hilary Layne, I respect the art of research. And also because the internet's a wild place, I was talking to Lady Emily about her video and about fanfiction, and some of the ideas she presented was so interesting and cool, I thought, hey, let's put in the video. And I value actually citing my sources accurately. I also want to give a shout out to the creator Cloud Parade, who already responded to Layne's video and whose live stream I watched in preparation for this video. But maybe we should give Layne the benefit of the doubt. Maybe we're being hyperbolic here. Maybe her video is well reasoned and well thought out. I'm sure it is.
I am aware that good fanfiction exists, or to be more accurate, I know that good fanfiction is possible, and I know that fanfiction in itself is a neutral thing, like all of fiction, and can be good or bad depending on the writer.
She starts off the video assuring us that there is good fanfiction out there. That's a good first, right? It does protect her from the comments of, what about this fanfiction? What about this fanfiction? By calling them outliers. But are they outliers?
However, in recent years, despite any outlying works of alleged genius, and they are outlying and not the norm, fanfiction has developed a manifestly particular kind of image and reputation. The aesthetics of fanfiction, if you'll allow me, have become a very specific sort, and that image and those aesthetics have broken internet containment and entered mainstream literature and storytelling.
Well, she cares more about the aesthetics of fanfiction rather than the reality of fanfiction. She appeals to public opinion as proof that fanfiction is bad, which, well, look, starting your video by saying, I know there's good fanfiction out there, but normal people who don't read it hate it, and therefore they must be more right than the readers of fanfiction. That's really stupid, actually. Like, really dumb.
When I say fanfiction in a crowded room, 90% of the people in that room immediately receive the mental image of the same general type of storytelling, which, by the way, is not a very flattering one.
You can't craft an argument about how one medium impacted another, destroyed everything, without knowing what's in that medium.
Regardless of what you personally might think about fanfiction, the community and the majority of known works, and crucially the influence of fanfictionism has had on the rest of the storytelling media, has a very, very specific philosophy and aesthetic. Singling out your own personal favorite works cannot change that fact.
You're arguing by perception rather than grounded reality. And it's profoundly superficial. You can't talk about the influence of one medium over the other without talking about what happens in those mediums. And indeed, she does later on discuss specific fanfiction, but in the most bad faith way possible and the most vague way possible. Hell, at no point in this video does she even mention My Immortal, which is such an easy punching bag for fanfiction haters to talk about.
I'm a goth, in case you couldn't tell, and I wear mostly black. I love Hot Topic and I buy all my clothes from there. For example, today I was wearing a black corset with matching lace around it and a black leather miniskirt, pink fishnets, and black combat boots. I was wearing black lipstick, white foundation, black eyeliner, and red eyeshadow.
When I made my little jab at fanfiction in my video on the rise of smut in fiction, many people came crawling out of the woodwork to send me various strongly worded messages about how wrong I was because, you know, that one particular XYZ fanfic was good, actually, and because not all fanfiction is smutty, actually. Listen, I don't really care.
She dismissed all feedback sent her way by the people who, you know, read the works.
I get it. Some of you like to read or write fanfiction, and some fanfiction is, to you, worth your time. But I'm talking today about the broad idea of what fanfiction generally has come to embody and mean in current year. So if you like fanfiction, that's your business. But before you get all fired up and start filling the comment section with angry remarks about how it's, you know, not all fanfiction, or whatever, try to take a step back and honestly observe the overall reputation that fanfiction has to the general reading public.
Layne, starting your statement by responding to people who engage with the medium you're discussing, by saying, I'm not talking about the dozens, if not hundreds, of individual stories that are successful, proven to be popular with audiences, and good. I'm just holding up the opinion of tourists who don't actually read anything we're talking about or engage with your medium. And that's more important to me than the works themselves. You fail as a critic, in my opinion, if you're holding the opinions of those who don't engage with the medium over the medium itself from a critical standpoint. Many fledgling mediums, including television, radio, movies, were met with similar dismissive criticisms from those who refused to engage with it.
This television thing, why would you want to stay home and watch a little box? Because it's convenient? Because you don't have to get dressed up? Because you can just sit there? I mean, how can you call that entertainment alone in your living room?
A critic's job is to analyze the work. Public reception is valuable in discussion, sure, but only when anchored to reality. This is because Layne isn't interested in specifics, but only her perception of generalities, especially a medium she's mostly disengaged with. When she does deep dives of a character, for example, as in her villain vid, which, again, watch that for more specifics, she demonstrates a profound superficiality, a limited viewpoint of how to analyze media, even by a case-by-case basis, where everything is presented right in front of her. Layne's weakness is that she presents ideas, but is incapable of giving examples, because she doesn't actually read said examples, or care enough to look outside her preconceived notions. Hell, let me go back to my vid about her. She presents multiple university theses and told her audience that these were all just works about one topic. I think it was about the ambiguity of morality of villains. But when I read them, I found that each essay was about something unique and different.
If you ever want to check and see if an English lit major is worth your time and money, you can go online and read the dissertations of lit majors from colleges all across America, which is, you know, something I did because I'm that kind of crazy. And you see this pervading line of thought running through these papers. I was searching mainly for theses on the subject of villainy, but this is all I found. Paper after paper about how villainy is a social construct and what specifically various iterations of villainy say about society at a given time.
She then decides to humiliate a bunch of college kids for their college term papers. I decided to do something that most YouTubers don't do, or most commentators don't do. Actually read the term papers she cites. And yeah, guess what? She's either misrepresenting or oversimplifying their arguments. Can you imagine that? One essay, for example, that she cites is about theatricality of evil in Batman stories, which, yeah, isn't close to what she's saying right here. Another is arguing that Shakespeare makes his villains alluring through the use of soliloquy. Again, not what Layne is talking about, but she frames it like it's some postmodern concept, when in actuality, the student is just saying, oh hey, Shakespeare shows you what the villains think, and that's good. Like, come on. She painted multiple different works with a broad stroke. She's not engaging with meaningful discussion, but rather dismissing it offhand under the same generality.
Another quick side note, a lot of people seem to really appreciate the list of additional information that I provided with my video about reading education. This particular topic, fanfiction, is not something a lot of people outside those communities are going to know a lot about, and I spent months doing research. So to help, I've put together a small companion document on my website that provides links to some relevant studies and data, as well as more information on fanfiction in general, and also some of the more disturbing fanfiction content, scandals, and other issues of interest to outside observers who genuinely want to educate themselves.
There's a specific article in her description of her vid, and we're going to read that because that's what she's providing. It's the article linked in her video, and I'm sure it's reasonable.
I suspect many who watch my video and read through this list of resources might arrive at the end with the impression that I want to ban or censor AO3 and other fanfiction sites. This is not true. I have not said this, and I will not say this because I don't hold that opinion in any way.
Foreshadowing is a literary device in...
I believe that adult human beings are obligated to maintain the health of their own minds themselves. It is every person's responsibility to guard his or her own mental and moral health. I believe that it is right and prudent to warn adult human beings that some things out there might cause them harm, physically, mentally, emotionally, or morally. My aim with my video and this list is to do just that, warn adults. What those adults do with that warning is up to them.
Layne's fear is that fanfiction will cause psychic pain to the reader.
Gowron's really sticking it to Sosuke.
But what does she mean by a social contagion? What does that imply? Well, let's keep reading.
When I was in my 20s, I was absolutely one of those sensitive, aesthetically minded young women who was drawn to the indulgent escapism of literature and storytelling across mediums. I absorbed fiction and books and loved finding places online where, ostensibly, similar-minded people tended to gather. My time in these spaces was on the very edge of a cultural transition that probably wasn't noticed except by those accidentally in unique positions, such as myself. As I tended to keep to myself, I was less immersed in these communities and saw for myself as they shifted under and around me. Literary communities such as those on Tumblr.com gradually, then suddenly, slipped into smut and shipping, and then became entirely pornographic. The language with which these communities interacted with any and all media was that of fanfiction. A new story emerged in the world, and it was immediately run through the fanfiction engine, and only in that form was it ingested. In time, I saw this spread elsewhere.
Because she's roughly my age, and I was roughly 20 around the time she was 20, I guess the existence of Sherlock fanfiction broke her mind or something.
Are you aware of this fanfiction about you and
I'm
Martin's characters?
startlingly aware of it. But yeah, I was amazed at the level of artistry. I mean, even the really dirty ones, it's kind of like, my God, people have spent hours doing this.
Or maybe she was just upset with the Naruto and Sasuke shippers, you know?
God, this is outrageous! I was supposed to be Sasuke's first kiss!
But again, this ignores how fanfiction was in Japan for decades before, you know, with the Dojin, and Star Trek fandom for that matter.
Let's indulge in a little bit of fandom archaeology and travel all the way back to 1973. Mary Sue was coined as a parody/dissection of this trope in its original form. She was a comically over-the-top self-insert character in a Star Trek fanzine, and I'd summarize, but it'd be easier to just read the first paragraph. Gee golly gosh glorioski, thought Mary Sue as she stepped on the bridge of the Enterprise. Here I am, the youngest lieutenant in the fleet, only 15 and a half years old.
We'll come back to this article as relevant throughout the video, but this is the kind of bullshit you can expect from her with this article. These kinds of wringing of the hands, exaggerated kind of responses, performative responses about how terrible everything is with fanfiction culture.
Some time ago, I said to a friend, half as a joke, that through no fault of its own, Harry Potter was about 70 to 80% responsible for the degradation of modern literature.
Layne argues Harry Potter is responsible for the degradation of modern literature, which, I mean, okay, let's put aside the fact J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling for a second here, right? And all the problems with her and her turfiness. The biggest contribution to literature that Harry Potter made is it got kids reading. Without Harry Potter's success, I don't think we'd have Percy Jackson be the big hit it was, or YA publishing for that matter being so big. The YA publishing scene dominated the marketing landscape for like 20 years, roughly. That same market led to the growing new adult, dark academia, romantasy genres, and modern fantasy really as a whole. And this has a ripple effect beyond just fanfiction. I would argue that without Harry Potter being published and popularizing fantasy, you would not have young readers who then become older readers seek out more, and by more mean better, fantasy literature, like say, the works of Brandon Sanderson. There are many things to criticize Harry Potter for. I have done this multiple times. However, at the time of its release, it was dismissed by critics like Harold Bloom by virtue of it just being a children's work.
One cannot be happy about the 35 million copies of Harry Potter. I had a piece in today's Wall Street
I saw
Journal.
the editorial, yes, the op-ed piece.
Yes,
We can't be happy about that?
No, I think that's not reading, because there's nothing there to be read. They're just an endless string of cliches. I cannot think that that does anyone any good. I mean, people tell me, well, at least the child is reading, to which my answer is no, the child isn't reading. That's not The Wind in the Willows. That's not Through the Looking Glass. That's not Charlotte's Web by E.B. White or James Thurber's The 13 Clocks. That's not really children's literature. It's really just slop.
What Layne is doing to fanfiction, critics like Bloom did to Harry Potter, which is to say, to dismiss it without actually engaging with it. If you're gonna hate something, do it like I do, and actually consume it first so you know why you hate it.
And while that observation is still valid, I think it's far more accurate to say that the strange, unprecedented way in which Harry Potter collided with fanfiction is the real problem. In that sense, it would be more accurate to say that fanfiction is 80 to 90% responsible for the degradation of modern literature. And that statement is something I stand by.
But no doubt Layne is going to discuss the various fanfiction writers who emerged after Harry Potter, such as Cassandra Clare, who is, I think, the most noteworthy Harry Potter fanfiction writer around because she famously turned her Arrow fanfiction about Hermione and Draco Malfoy into the mega YA fantasy saga that started with The Mortal Instruments.
Judith's first book, City of Bones, came out in March 2007. This was the first of the Shadowhunters books, the first series being The Mortal Instruments, but that was not the first thing that she wrote that was called The Mortal Instruments. The other one was an incest fic. Cassie's writing started in fanfiction. Going under the name Cassandra Clare with an I, she wrote very popular fanfiction, one being the Draco trilogy, which was Harry Potter fanfiction starring Draco Malfoy, and The Very Secret Diaries, which was based on The Lord of the Rings. She did delete her fanfiction from the internet shortly before publishing City of Bones, but you can find it if you know where to look, which I did.
Now, you can argue the quality of The Mortal Instruments. I clearly would say they're garbage, but other writers started writing Harry Potter fanfiction also, and that includes Olivia Blake, the author of Atlas 6, L. Stoddard Hannock, the author of Cruel and Beautiful World, the trilogy of that, and Jada Jones, the co-author of Have Mercy. Jones in particular wrote a sprawling fanfiction called The Shoebox Project, which was immensely popular in the fandom. It was like a Marauders prequel thing, if I remember correctly. But one of the best authors who started with fanfiction, it's Naomi Novik, who is an immensely prolific fantasy writer, who co-founded the Organization of Transformative Works, the Hugo Award-winning organization that created AO3, Archive of Our Own. This is the important institution that has protected transformative works from legal threats over the last several decades.
I think it's really great to start out as a writer in a place where you have total freedom to decide what you want to say, what you are interested in, what characters you care about, what stories you care about. If I'm not interested in what I'm writing, if I'm not really excited about it, then nobody else is going to be excited about it either.
Another example is Rainbow Rowell, a writer who, I'll be also honest, has had her fair share of criticisms with the whole depiction of Asian characters, which, you know, that's a whole thing. But her novel Fangirl and the subsequent spin-off series Carry On is a tribute to fanfiction and fanfiction culture, and a pastiche of Harry Potter fanfiction that shows how fans reinterpret a work and want to transform it in some way, to bring their worldview to a world that they can cozy up inside in. And this doesn't count authors who gain popularity for doing Harry Potter before Harry Potter and better, like, say, Ursula K. Le Guin, nor authors who undoubtedly saw what Harry Potter was doing and tried to do it better, in my opinion successfully, such as Lev Grossman with the Magician series. And I want to also point out, because this is important, most of the fanfictions we just discussed were published and written before J.K. Rowling revealed herself to be a giant turd. If they publish fanfiction after 2020, then no, fair game, criticize them all you want. In fact, Naomi Novik never wrote Harry Potter fanfiction as far as I can tell. She based one of her stories off of Mastering Commander fanfiction, which is by far the most nerdy thing I've heard in years, and I love that for her. But Layne's talking about the fanfiction that made LGBTQIA content everywhere, right? So that's stuff like what Carry On was talking about. The idea that fans can take a familiar thing and transform it and indeed write their own works after the fact.
Of her origins, she says, after I read the Harry Potter books, my best friend was heading off to medical school, and I asked her if there was anything I could do to amuse her while she was there being tortured by the professors, and she said she would like me to write her a story about Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy and how they switched places, and that became the Draco trilogy, which I wrote for her, and then she said, you should put it it up somewhere online. So I did. It was like the first 3 or 4 chapters at that point. I'd never interacted with any fan community. I didn't know who wrote fanfiction. It was a complete mystery to me. I'd found fanfiction.net by Googling, and I just put it there because I was trying to find a place that had an easy upload interface, and there were no Harry Potter archives at the time that I could find. But she would eventually get booted off fanfiction.net for plagiarism.
But how does Layne describe Harry Potter's impact? Well, it's shipping. Apparently.
An essay I read recently, which I subsequently misplaced, observed that Harry Potter was the series that launched 1,000 ships. For those who don't know, a ship is when fans of a story will root for 2 characters to get into a relationship. Hence, ship. A person could be said to ship 2 characters, that is, hope they get together. In more modern usage, however, ship means that as far as that fan is concerned, those 2 characters should be together, or even are together, regardless of what the story says. And never before in history had this been as huge of an almost global cultural reality as it was during the heyday of Harry Potter.
Shipping is the big negative of Harry Potter fandom, apparently, which is interesting because I always thought shipping was popular back with the Star Trek fans.
Kirk and Spock, the granddaddies of modern fandom as we know it, these shipped to give our foremothers brain rot. The pairing to literally coin the term slash for shipping is canon after how many years? I guarantee you there are some Trekkies watching this like, fools, they've been canon!
Or the Dragon Rider of Pern fans, or hell, fans of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, who famously got a cease and desist from the author herself over writing fanfiction of her characters.
Shakespeare's plays were often based on well-known stories, both recent and ancient. Many popular authors in the Victorian era saw their works pastiched and sequelized for the mainstream with and without their authorization. This happened all the time, with Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes during his lifetime. Even his pal Peter Pan writer J.M. Barrie got in on the fun with a story called The Late Sherlock Holmes.
When watching the Sarah Z video, she argues that the internet is to blame for the rise of fanfiction, which, yeah, that makes sense.
The advent of the internet has changed the way that we view, consume, and create art. In a world where the traditional gatekeepers and outlets are no longer the only way for works to reach the masses, you're going to see new communities and new forms of art getting attention. This is especially true for fan content and especially true of fanfiction. Fanfiction has existed for decades, yes, going back to at least the 60s with Star Trek and even earlier depending on your definition of fanfic. But it wasn't until the normalization of the internet that fanfic seemed to really take off as its own large subculture, one easily accessible for those who want to write it and those who want to read it.
Harry Potter, Pokemon, and many other fandoms emerged in popularity around the time the internet started. It was the perfect cocktail of multiple fanfictions. I remember when Gundam Wing was launching. A huge online fandom for that, by the way, back in the late 90s. Tons of shipping. There were tons of shipping wars over Gundam Wing. And granted, Harry Potter was massively popular in fandom culture and did jumpstart a lot of ships. Undeniably so. But that's because J.K. Rowling couldn't write romance to save herself, and fans had to pick up the slack. It is what it is. Again, Carry On, that got that one pretty on the nose there. Layne then dismisses the entire YA genre for the decline of modern fanfiction, honing in on Twilight? Which Layne argues was originally Harry Potter fanfiction.
Do you think YA literature is partly to blame for the decline in literature right now? Think fanfiction. Specifically think Twilight, which was originally a work of Harry Potter fanfiction.
What's going on with you? What are you talking about? You sound insane.
No, Twilight was never Harry Potter fanfiction. You're thinking of the Mortal Instruments. Cassandra Clare, not Stephanie Meyer. No, Cassandra Clare, that was Harry Potter fanfiction. Layne, what the actual fuck are you talking about? You made over an hour long video and you don't know that Twilight was not fanfiction? And listen, I looked for any source possible that Layne could be citing, because she doesn't cite her sources. I dug for this for hours. I couldn't find a single fucking thing that could ever give Layne the impression that Twilight was ever Harry Potter fanfiction. Hell, I couldn't even find proof that Stephanie Meyer read Harry Potter before writing Twilight. What are you talking about? You're an authority on this, and this early on you're making a major mistake?
Do you think E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey is a major offender in the rise of smut in modern society? Think fanfiction.
Now, 50 Shades of Grey, yeah, that is Twilight fanfiction, but it's also not YA. We're talking about YA, right?
Do you think YA literature is partly to blame for the decline in literature right now?
You brought down the entire medium of YA, and you can't cite a single YA novel that is in fact fanfiction? There are examples. Like why not discuss Mayer's contemporaries like Suzanne Collins, John Green, Leigh Bardugo, Rainbow Rowell, Becky Albateri, the countless other authors that wrote in the YA space this time who were friendly with fanfiction culture. Hell, Hank Green, John Green's brother, created a whole series of fanfiction for Jane Austen back in the day. It was a web series.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. My mom gave each of us one of these last Christmas. I have yet to wear it. Ever.
Very successful, by the way. Why not cite that? Right? Tamsin Muir, the author of Gideon the Ninth and its sequels, right? They bridge the gap between YA and adult fantasy perfectly. Well, adult sci-fi, what I'm trying to say. What you might not know about Muir is that she wrote explicitly violent Homestuck fanfiction back in the day. Yeah, that tracks, doesn't it? Hell, a more well-read answer for YA literature would have argued that Sarah J. Maas got her start writing works heavily inspired by Sailor Moon.
Sarah J. Maas has been in love with fantasy since she was 12 years old. 3 decades later, the fantasy author is a force within the publishing industry. She's written 15 books, sold more than 38 million copies, and is a #1 New York Times best-selling author.
And Marissa Meyer, the author of Cinder, was famous for writing Sailor Moon fanfiction back in the day, which inspired her work with Cinder. You know, maybe that's it. Maybe Layne saw Marissa Meyer and thought it was Stephanie Meyer, even though Cinder is leagues better than Twilight. I mean, I wouldn't argue it's high literature, but it's still better than Twilight, I would argue. And besides, Layne, fanfiction became popular back in the 60s and 70s with the Star Trek fandom. Again, Star Trek was a big deal, and its fandom was a big deal. The push for the fandom to continue the series led to Star Trek's prominence again after its cancellation, resulting in decades of media purely thanks to fan culture and fan demand. You can argue that the entire early fantasy genre, from Shannara to Dungeons & Dragons, exists because of fan inspiration. Hell, Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné, one of the most prominent early fantasy stories, started as a response to Tolkien and Conan the Barbarian, because Michael Moorcock hated them. Spite is always a good motivator, by the way. They're not fan fiction, but they are works in conversation with another that are transformative. The fact is that anyone who knows basic information about fan culture and fan inspiration can tell Layne is entirely full of shit. And we're not even 5 minutes into the video. Pray for me, please.
Worse than that, fanfiction was making tangible contributions to the shape and trajectory of literature and culture. And as a result, both have suffered massively.
But what tangible impacts does Layne think fanfiction has caused on publishing? Well, let's analyze that, shall we? Layne outlines the pillars of what she has blamed fanfiction for in literature.
But first I want to talk about some general observations I've made about the influence of fanfiction on popular culture and the literary world, and then we'll break down each one at a time. First, fanfiction is directly responsible for the epidemic of self-insert characters and self-insert mentality that has pervaded the entirety of storytelling across all mediums. Second, fanfiction is directly responsible for the smut-pocalypse that has devastated literature. Third, fanfiction is directly responsible for the meta-derivative nature of storytelling that is starting to become dominant.
Well, I will explain Layne's specifics in a bit, but let's break this down initially. The book that is widely credited for popularizing the modern romantasy genre, which I think is the spark of the smut-pocalypse you're describing, is Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses. It's not the only book. I mean, Anne Rice wrote her Sleeping Beauty trilogy before that, but it's a good example of where to start. Also, obviously, 50 Shades of Grey, but that goes without say. Also, obviously, doujinshi have been doing this for years as well, but I'm sure Japan and their fanfiction will never factor into this discussion at all.
Foreshadowing is a literary device and
as mentioned before, Maas did write fiction on fictionpress.com, a sister site for fanfiction.net, and those works were inspired by Sailor Moon, Buffy, and more. But that does not mean she wrote fanfiction.
And I not only loved reading them, I realized I wanted to write those stories. So I just kind of began writing very bad attempts at writing fantasy novels. And then it took me until I was about 16 to really get the first solid idea.
Which became one of your best-selling
books. Yes, which
books.
became my Throne of Glass series.
You started writing this book when you were 16 years old?
Yes.
Sarah J. Maas wrote on communities adjacent to the fanfiction communities, but I don't think she wrote fanfiction heavily, nor did those works heavily inspire the work she eventually published. Now, her work is derivative, yeah, but then again so is the Shannara Chronicles, and that's not fanfiction, is it? Further, to blame the self-insert craze, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, Dungeons & Dragons is a game about literally inserting yourself into your fantasy epics that you love. And that exists for decades before Harry Potter, which Layne is pointing to as the initial point of the fanfiction boom.
I'm casting Magic Missile! Why are you casting Magic Missile? There's nothing to attack here. I'm attacking the darkness!
By Layne's logic, how can Dungeons & Dragons exist without, it doesn't make sense. There's a hole here. And again, self-inserts have existed since literature began. Dante Aligheri wrote himself into a story where he got to hang out with his favorite poets and favorite historical figures, and that was in 13 AD. This is not a new phenomenon. However, AO3's tagging system, now that's a point. That's something that she can work with. Layne has an argument there. The tagging system has influenced how modern books are published, thanks a lot to TikTok culture. However, this only extends to tropes that already existed, are either marketing terms to use to sell books, or crutches that weak writers remain confined by and can't transcend beyond. Being restricted by genre tropes and expectations is nothing new. All writers over the years have to some extent dealt with this, the conventions of genre, and whether or not you rise above them or subject yourself to the stereotypes. Penny Dreadfuls, Harlequin novels, they exist to fulfill the standard tropes and expectations, and the great works that rise from that do something a little different, that survive years later. Hell, Phantom of the Opera was basically a Penny Dreadful. It's how it is. The reason that older genre fare seems better is because you haven't read most of what was published in those days. For example, ever read Varney the Vampire? No, probably not, because it's been forgotten by time. But it was a massive penny dreadful, basically, in the 1800s about a vampire. It was hugely influential in its time and widely read in its time, but we've basically forgotten about it because it's a staple of genre convention that we've moved beyond. We're even beginning to see fantasy from within the last 100 years experience this. Terry Goodkind and Piers Anthony are not as widely read as they were in their day because the works just aren't that good from them. But the difference is that Layne doesn't read those old books, though she loves to cite them.
Related to that, fanfiction is partly responsible for the overall drop in literary quality and is directly responsible for the degradation of the art of writing, including but not limited to dismal world building and one-dimensional characters, as well as the elevation of arguably non-literary approaches to certain styles, such as the disproportionate use of present tense.
Layne argues that fanfiction is directly responsible for the degradation of modern writing, and cites the use of the present tense in particular. Now, that's odd, because the popularity of the present tense in fiction, you can cite actually to Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games, which itself was written in present tense to create a more active, intense vibe to the writing. It was a deliberate choice.
The first issue is most definitely the most important, and we're going to approach it more broadly than mere self-insertism, because the real issue there, the core issue, is the immense inherently self-indulgent nature of fanfiction as it is in current year. So what do I mean when I say that fanfiction is self-indulgent? First, let's look at the definition of self-indulgence. To indulge oneself or one's inclinations. And indulgence itself is defined as, among other things, over-leniency, gratifying appetites and desires, lack of restraint, giving way to temptation or inclination, yielding to gratification. Self-indulgence prioritizes pleasure over difficulty. Self-indulgence turns restraint, self-discipline, and self-mastery into problematic trigger words that are deemed some form of elitism or ableism or some kind of big bad ism. But what does self-indulgence mean in literature? Self-indulgence for a writer means that every storytelling choice made by the writer is prioritizing the writer's fantasies, pleasure, appetites, and desires over the story, the characters, or the overall quality. To be clear, I do not mean that writers shouldn't write what they like or enjoy, but rather that writers who are honestly trying to write the best story they can and who are prioritizing the good of the story will very often put their fantasies and their emotional appetites and desires aside in order to make the story better. A self-indulgent writer would never do such a thing because the primary function of writing for a self-indulgent writer is personal gratification. And this necessitates the avoidance of anything that is particularly uncomfortable to the writer.
She argues that fanfiction is self-indulgent, that writing needs to prioritize the writer's wants and needs over what makes a story challenging or effective. This, of course, seems to ignore how so many writers who have ties to fandom actually push against the limitations more than hide behind them. And sometimes you need to write a story that is self-indulgent to learn the rules of writing before you can make something far, far better. A great example is an author I've mentioned earlier in this video that I want to highlight again, Leigh Bardugo.
When we pick up a book, even if it's nonfiction, we're leaving our experiences behind and entering a new world with its own systems of power, atmosphere, and rules. When we get into fantasy, it gets even more challenging, and I'm going to tell you how I meet those challenges.
Now, I'm not a huge fan of Leigh Bardugo's first trilogy, Shadow and Bone, but I absolutely love her follow-up, the duology Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. I think Shadow and Bone is a great example of a younger writer exploring popular tropes that they like, and with each book, improving, learning how to build beyond the tropes that you like. And Six of Crows is a writer who is taking the training wheels off the bike, understands how to integrate character, plot, and spectacle together, and goes, how can I make you fall in love with 6 outcasts before absolutely breaking them apart before your eyes?
My characters usually begin as archetypes. They are almost rough sketches that exist within the outline I'm developing. So for Six of Crows, it was a thief with a gift for unlikely escapes, a gambler who can't walk away from a wager. For Ninth House, it was a troubled young woman with a second chance surrounded by people who burn through second chances. And for The Familiar, it's a humble servant girl and a mysterious man under a curse. But just as when you meet someone, you think you know them, hopefully in the course of writing them, I'm beginning to see the things that keep them unique and keep them from simply falling into cliche.
And many of Bardugo's creative choices come from drawing on her own life experiences. Her disability, for example, led to her crafting the character Kaz Brekker in Six of Crows, who is himself disabled. He needs a cane. However, personality-wise, Kaz Brekker is nothing like Leigh Bardugo, so he is certainly not a self-insert character.
Some characters, it feels like you're meeting them. They arrive fully formed, speaking loud and clear in a distinctive voice on the page, and other characters take a little while to develop. When I was writing Six of Crows, Matthias arrived loud and clear. Nina, she took a little longer to develop. And I remember there was a moment where she was having an interaction with Kaz. She's eating a cake. She has crumbs on her cleavage, and Kaz notes this and she says, I don't care. And I thought, oh, that's my girl.
Her university experiences directly influenced the creation of her Dark Academia series that starts with Ninth House. She writes what she knows and knows how to write it well. And that's a key difference between a lot of writers who just write what they know and only end superficially.
I know that there are some people who would hear all this and genuinely find nothing wrong, but I think an honest person who seeks to better and master himself or herself as a person or as a writer would recognize that such tendencies are damaging and courting disaster.
The implication that writing self-indulgent works is bad only makes sense if you can assume the author never will improve. That if they write one work that is limited, that's all they'll ever write, which is stupid, frankly. It implies that we can't develop, can't evolve, can't surpass limitations.
Self-indulgence means that villains can't be too disturbing, or rather the wrong kind of disturbing, as that would be uncomfortable for the writer to write. Or, to borrow the new popular adjective, it would be icky. Which is where we get genocidal maniacs who are nevertheless really good at sorting out their minions' pronouns, and also would never use a racial slur. Being a genocidal maniac will in some ways serve the emotional needs of the writer, sure, but those emotional needs would be harmed if the villain was insensitive to gender issues.
No, but the problem that Layne cites isn't that writers can ever improve, it's that we won't let them have the villains say the slurs. That's the problem. Layne says writers should put more slurs in their writing. So more slurs 2028, Layne right there. Apparently. Because slurs, of course, are a metric of good writing, of course. You know, Mark Twain without his slurs is nothing, I guess. Also, this discourse about being the wrong type of disturbing, it gets very funny when later on, Layne discusses dead dove fanfiction. Yeah, this doesn't age well.
Self-indulgence means the heroes will have long conversations with each other about popular current year political issues, despite the fact that they live in 13th century England or 38th century Saturn or some random medieval fantasy setting. Self-indulgence demands above all representation, something we're going to talk about more in a minute here, but that's why you get an abundance of people of, say, African descent in stories set in Scotland in the 11th century, for example, or stories in which people who were not of period-accurate English ethnicity in most or all of ruling classes of Georgian Britain, with no reasonable explanation.
Layne argues it's bad that stories include diverse characters in historical periods. Oh boy, let's unpack this one, shall we? The first example that she cites is an article about a children's book that shows Scotland's history as multicultural. Specifically, the Picts are depicted as black. In one children's book, apparently. And let's be fair, we really don't know much about the Picts. Most accounts of the Picts were written by outside sources, like the Romans, like centuries later, after they were gone, essentially, or integrated into Scottish culture more thoroughly. And frankly, I don't know if Layne's been to Scotland, whether she's an expert on it. I mean, I know I'm not an expert on Scotland. I'm not a Scottish historian. I'm just basing what I know off of what I know. But we really know very little about the Picts, because most of what was preserved was written by people who barely interacted with them. And that's what survives. So historians got to take what they take, you know? But the implication here is that black people didn't live in Europe in the medieval era, which, strap in for this one. The invasion of Carthage into Rome brought an influx of people from throughout the Middle East and northern Africa into Europe via Spain. Most of these people, after the Punic Wars, settled throughout Europe. Further, many fishermen from northern Africa would settle up throughout the Mediterranean, especially in Sicily and southern Italy. Moors, as they're described, were so prominent that they'd actually make appearances in numerous Shakespeare plays, including Othello. Othello, by the way, is in fact a Moor. The point is that black people existed throughout Europe so visibly that Shakespeare in London knew about them. Additionally, in every Shakespeare play that has a Moor in it, the discussion of racism is in fact present in the text of the play. So to imply that current year issues are discussed whenever anyone discusses, say, diversity or inclusion is pretty fucking rich, considering Othello has a speech about inclusion in Act 1 of the play. This is historic fact. You can argue whether they were very prominent or where they were most prominent in, but the implication that Europe was a continent comprising exclusively of white people has been out of date at minimum for 2,200 years. At minimum.
Period accuracy is completely irrelevant to the self-indulgent writer who is only writing to feed his or her own personal fantasies and emotional needs. As I said, we'll get more into self-representation in a bit here.
If you want to talk about fanfiction self-indulgence, and how about how every adaptation of Wuthering Heights ignores the fact that Heathcliff, in the original Bronte text, is not white.
Throughout Wuthering Heights, there are multiple references to Heathcliff's skin color and his assumed ethnicities and races. Here are all the examples. If I missed any, feel free to add or put a page quote in there, but I took receipts because people are annoying, and so this is what I have to do to show that I did indeed read this entire book.
He is described as dark-skinned and foreign-looking by Emily Bronte, though whether that means he's part black or Romani is up in the air. However, almost every adaptation of Wuthering Heights, including the one coming out next year, ignores this and makes him the whitest white bread to ever white. I would argue that's far more self-indulgent than depicting black people existing in Europe, but what would I know? I only read the shit I talk about before I start talking about it. What do I fucking know about the topics, right? I just read the books. Meanwhile, Layne complains about Bridgerton having actors of color in it. It should be by this point that you realize that Layne's problem isn't that modern writers are self-indulgent, but rather that her preferences aren't satisfied. That her vision of a purely white Europe aren't embraced by every single work of fiction out there. And Bridgerton is a work of fiction. Bridgerton very clearly aligns itself as inspired by history, not reflective of history. As a result, it's impossible to argue it's even trying to be accurate. It's just a fun historical romance story. That's it. She's not mad that other writers are self-indulgent, she's mad she can't be more self-indulgent. She's mad that writers are told to write what they know, and what they know isn't what she knows. Therefore, it can't be right.
Fanfiction, as I've said, has been around forever. There are some crazy folks out there who would go as far as to say that Dante's Divine Comedy is fanfiction. I think people who say that don't have a very good grasp on the spirit of medieval literature and approach stories with a fixed modern view, but sure.
She also finally admits that Dante Aligheri's work is fanfiction, so I'll take that as a win. Yes, medieval writing is written differently, but, Layne never actually explains how Dante Aligheri's writing is different. Why is his self-insert different from another self-insert? Well, she doesn't tell you. She doesn't explain. It should be obvious, apparently, to Layne, but she doesn't bother to explain it. Which I take as saying she doesn't know either. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Even though Dante Alighieri wrote about politics of his era, about the war in Florence, he understood that, the politics and culture of his time. And he wrote how his muse Beatrice, a girl he only met a couple times in his lifetime, how he and her are together in the afterlife and just best buddies and how she cares so much about him. It's wish fulfillment. That's all it is. It is self-indulgent. It's also great literature, because self-indulgent doesn't mean jack. The motivation of the writer is less important than what they produce in the end. You can write the most self-indulgent work possible, or the most selfless work possible. It doesn't matter, because the end result that gets in the hands of readers is what matters. It's incredibly disingenuous to dismiss people drawing connections between Dante and the modern era, but that's because Layne stinks at laying out her arguments. If she could explain herself, different story. But she can't, so she's not going to. It's important to remember that some stories do exist perfectly in their era, but the ones that survive are relatable to an audience because despite the works being the same, these common elements remain universal.
Jane Austen remains so popular because, while societal standards have greatly shifted since the Regency era, meddling families, battles of class, and the quest for love in the face of stifling conformity are ideas that have never stopped being relevant. The same goes for something like Sherlock Holmes, because humans thrive on mysteries and the comforting closure of someone who can solve them. It's no wonder Austen and Conan Doyle have had their works reinvented countless times over the decades. The fanfic-esque reinvention of, say, Pride and Prejudice offers new point of view and challenges for writers. How does Lizzie and Darcy's story change when the setting is moved to another country? What changes about their familial tensions when they are modern-day Muslims in Toronto? What about if genders are swapped, or it's a same-gender romance? If the basic plot is good, you can do whatever you want with it. And there's something magical about it.
there's nothing wrong with updating or changing the core elements of a story to modernize it for an audience if the core remains the same. Layne has another quote worth referencing from her article around this point, in the subsection titled The Self-Indulgence of Fanfiction. A great title, by the way, Layne. Really selling the whole thing about fanfiction destroying everything. Also, terminal cancer representation, really? She complains about own voices literature, where she looks at several cases of insensitive representation and criticizes them. Of course, own voices refers to the movement in literature where people write the authentic stories about their own life experiences and tell their own stories. Basically, if you're black, write about your black experiences. If you're native, write about your native experiences. If you're gay, write about being gay. And that would allow an authenticity in literature to prevail. There are criticisms, of course, of this notion that people outside those demographics are restricted from writing about these topics, but there are many resources out there for writers who are maybe white, wanting to write better black people, or writers who are straight, wanting to write better gay people, to write them, and that goes to trans people as well, all the whole spectrum of different people out there, to help them write more authentically and present a more accurate depiction of the people, so they don't come across as stereotypical. Layne, of course, hates this. She says it's bad, actually, to do research on a topic. I'm not surprised she'd hate to do research. That tracks with everything else I've learned about her so far. Layne complains about all attempts to be inclusive in fiction, and almost every example she cites in her article about how it's bad to be inclusive was criticized for either reinforcing racist hierarchies or undercutting progress of some way, or undercutting people's rights to be happy, or just being bad books, That's the thing too. A lot of these are criticized for just being offensive and tasteless, So, for example, Layne cites an article criticizing The Help and claims the following about this article.
A 15-year-old article about The Help by Catherine Stockett, which was maligned in its day because Stockett was a white woman writing the voices of black women.
Now, that sounds compelling enough if you just don't click the link, but I chose to click the link and I found the article. The article cited isn't even direct criticism. It's an article showcasing a few different perspectives of the book. And there's one paragraph that's critical of The Help. It's just one paragraph. Layne was that offended by one paragraph. From Ms. Magazine and the Christian Science Monitor, they quote those two in that one paragraph and says it's odd how the black characters talk through these over-the-top dialects while the white characters don't, even though they're both from the South, so they should have similar talking styles and dialects. Like, why aren't the Southern women who are white written phonetically, but only the black people are? It's kind of othering in a way that's designed to make them sound less intelligent, some would argue, but I digress. It's one paragraph, and the article immediately undercuts that criticism by saying, well, other people don't care about that, or it rises above its flaws, so it's like, okay, so Layne's best example of anti-help writing is an article that actually promotes The Help as a choice. And by the way, The Help is often criticized for feeding into the myth of the white savior, a story structure where black characters can't help themselves, but rather need a good white person to combat racism, as opposed to fighting for themselves.
2011's The Help, which explores racial tensions between black domestic workers and their white employers during the civil rights movement, chooses as a protagonist not the maids, but the young white woman who wants to write a book about them.
I'd really like to interview you, Abeline. I know it's scary.
The volume and popularity of white savior films to this day shows how committed our culture remains to centering white characters in stories about civil rights, black history, and racism. Meanwhile, these movies can frequently lack three-dimensionality in their portraits of black and POC characters.
I love me some fried chicken.
While the white protagonists often get love stories and complex character development, the non-white characters tend to be reduced to their negative experiences.
It's a trope that is very stereotypical in fiction and omnipresent. You have seen at least one white savior film in your lifetime.
These movies, usually made by white writers and directors, continue to receive top awards over films depicting the same themes made by black filmmakers.
I mean, every time somebody's driving somebody, I lose.
So the most fundamental issue is that white creators continue to dominate a conversation where it's vital that black voices are featured most of all.
But surely Layne isn't just going to do one example of that, right? Let's go to another example. There's Kira Drake's The Continent, right? That was rewritten after advanced copies were widely criticized by readers, and we'll get to why. Let's hear Layne's take on the controversy first.
Kira Drake's The Continent was immediately condemned all over the internet after advance copies were sent out. Why? For featuring stereotype indigenous characters and other kinds of perceived sins against representation. She also caved and said, "It's so true." She then enlisted sensitivity readers and rewrote the book. This article shows old passages alongside the revised version. Very interesting.
Okay, so what actually happened? Well, the content depicts a group of two theoretical native tribes combating each other, and one of them is called the Topi, which sounds a lot like the Hopi, which is a federally recognized indigenous tribe that really exists, so off to a great start already. Now, said tribe, the Topi, is described as wearing bones, being dark-skinned, and being violent, murdering savages. Yeah, I can't imagine why the Hopi don't like this take all that well. The author also removed, in response to criticism, 24 instances of calling the Topi, now renamed the Zoe, savage, primitive, and native. Yeah, that's a lot of othering language there. And that the only solution to stopping the Topi was to just massacre them. Violence is the only solution. Yeah, I can't imagine why natives don't like that option. Now, clearly Layne's explanation of the book left out a few key details. I mean, what are you going to do? Discuss the controversy fairly so your readers actually know what's happening? Or are you going to be disingenuous about it? Why would you be honest about it? By the way, this is a passage of the original version of the content. We have one, actually. So let's compare and contrast. First the old, then the revised.
Build walls, destroy access points, create defenses the likes of which have never been seen on the continent. Spirian construction is vastly superior to anything the natives can contrive. Don't you see? You can save the Avenue without raising so much as a finger against the Topi. You have the power to end this. You have the power to stop another war.
And now, the revised version.
Build towers so that the Avenue might see when a Zoe force is coming. Establish plain sight of all access points. Create defenses the likes of which have never been seen on the continent. And then, down the line, perhaps the Spire can help the Avenue and the Zoe to meet in the middle, to accomplish a peace of their own accord. Don't you see? You can help without raising so much as a single weapon. You have the power to end this. You have the power to stop another war.
I think there's a substantial difference here with how one is written over the other. Obviously so. But Layne thinks it's ridiculous that a very real tribe of people would rather not be depicted as mindless, cruel savages with no culture of their own who can only be stopped through mass extermination. I can't imagine why that would offend anyone. Layne, really, this is the lane you're going down, Layne. This is the side you're defending.
We've talked a bit about cultural decay and the prevalence of postmodern philosophy on this channel already. We've also talked about how the modern way in which children are taught to read, with a strong emphasis on personal emotional interpretations of texts, that are guided by their superiors, of course, alters their ability to both think and write. So you should already understand what I mean when I say that the bulk of modern writers have a very different approach to the art and the practice of telling a story than used to be the norm.
Layne then argues it's bad that stories today are driven by emotion, rather than logic and morals. By the way, this has nothing to do with modern fanfiction. Actually, it has more to do with the romantic writers of the 1800s, who rebelled against the neoclassical writers of the first part of the century. Edgar Allan Poe, the Brontes, the Shelleys, they all rejected the rigid order of their world and created narratives driven by emotive feeling over coherence and order. The world reflected by emotions in the individual rather than dictated by society's needs. But no, it's definitely the social media and college classes that made modern literature motively driven, and not centuries of other writers influencing more writers after them within the last 200 years. The problem is Layne wants to blame the trends of modern writing on modernity, and it's simply ridiculous and untrue, and maybe a little foolish.
To call it self-indulgent is probably too kind, but the average young person with storytelling aspirations has, for at least a decade, been almost exclusively emotion-driven in every way. They have also been brought up saturated in the moral and cultural landscape created by social media: attention-seeking, self-absorption, narcissism, propaganda, emotional generative hot words, pop culture trends masquerading as important social themes, critical literacy, and the poisonous influence of internet politics have created anxious, fragmented, hollow creatures who nevertheless crave meaning and profundity in their stories. Combine that with the enormous emotional battering ram that they receive in college literature and creative writing classes. Combine that with the online influence of intensely aesthetically and emotionally self-indulgent online environments like Tumblr. Combine that with things like masculinity and femininity being under constant, confusing, endlessly shifting assault by the cultural police of our modern society.
I think this is the video that basically shows that Layne is nothing more than a culture war grifter. And we hear this rant where she basically blames ambiguity in society for all of its problems. She basically all but says she is mad that society has evolved past her classical conservative Catholic perspective of the world. Which, in fairness, is exactly what she's mad about, because that actually did happen. Yeah, we have evolved past, living in 13 AD. You see, Layne's reoccurring thesis across her whole channel is that any deviation from her classically trained mindset is bad. And unlike, say, a normal conservative who wants to remember the 1950s fondly and all that, she cites Thomas Aquinas with nostalgia and reverence. We're talking old. We're talking centuries old. Now, she was someone who's homeschooled, right? And she sees modern schooling and education as beneath her, because she was taught better, apparently, than all of us common folk with a classical education. Emphasis on classical. But unlike, say, R.F. Kuan, who sees the colonialist element of modern education and criticizes it fairly and directly, Layne's vague. She blames crap from the last 20 years on everything, and nothing is really rooted in classic pedagogy. There's centuries of progress in the Crusades, Layne. Things have happened.
Many of these would-be writers then turn to their favorite stories for escape, stories they grew up with and which are, to them, a kind of cultural and narrative safe space. Stories in our times now like Twilight, Percy Jackson, Star Wars, My Hero Academia, Naruto, Sailor Moon, or, Harry Potter. Some more classically minded writers will fall in love with the Iliad or the Odyssey or Shakespeare, but none of these stories are exactly what these emotionally formed types of readers need in order to feel emotionally fulfilled in our constantly changing society in which emotions are the only valid currency.
She laments that readers today just aren't sophisticated enough to read the classics like the Iliad and the Odyssey or Shakespeare, because modern readers need emotion to drive them. To which I have to say, have you fucking read Shakespeare?
A plague on both your houses!
Shakespeare plays are entirely driven by emotional characters whose actions lead to cathartic fates. Not logical fates, cathartic fates. The famous to be or not to be speech. I mean, you have a skull on your desk. I know you've recited it to yourself alone at times. It's all about Hamlet's emotional state of time. Will he be or will he not be? Will he live another day or succumb to his own grief and stress and anxiety and explore the undiscovered continent of which he fears, yet longs to know? These are all emotive. They're not logical. I would argue also that Romeo and Juliet is far more emotionally driven than Percy Jackson and Harry Potter. No one acts logically in that damn play. They're all driven by their gut instincts or feelings from below the belt, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, the play says it too. Why should I not? And all the comedies, for that matter, like A Midsummer's Night's Dream, it's all just emotive passion, pathos, one of the driving factors of storytelling. And talking like modern fiction is too gay when you're advocating for the Iliad, where half of that epic is just Achilles crying over his boyfriend. Come on. But new thing bad and old thing good, am I right? If it's old, it's good. If it's new, it's bad. Maybe the reason that Layne hates modern education is because you quickly learn through the modern education system that the only thing separating the classics from the new hits is time and perspective. Many classic works were trashed on in their debut. The words didn't change, Layne. Time did.
So they take to fan fiction to change these stories or characters or update them or shift things around so the story satisfies some specific fantasy or emotional desire. This can be relatively harmless, like a fan fiction in which Hamlet gets his revenge and then lives happily ever after with Ophelia. Or it can be incredibly disturbing, like fan fiction in which Princess Leia develops a romantic and sexual attraction to Jabba the Hutt during her captivity. And that's probably the tamest fan fiction I saw in AO3.
And then Layne admits that she read a story about where Leia found attraction to Jabba the Hutt, and insisted this was the tamest thing she found. You know, Layne, if that's the case, if that's the tamest fanfiction you found, then it sounds like a you problem. Because you read the tags, you choose based on what the tags say, you read it, you sought it out. God forbid she looks at Willy Wonka fanfiction next. That'll really expand her perspectives a little, am I right? I spent 2 minutes writing that joke, please laugh.
In a normal world, such a diversion would be, in some cases, harmless and short-lived, which is to say, this kind of thing, minus the disturbing perversions, is normal in young teens, and then they grow out of it. In our society, people don't really grow out of anything. Ours is a society in which people have developed a prolonged, almost eternal childhood. This is aided by the immense prevalence of emotions. But regardless of the reason, if emotions rule, then emotions will always be served. And if luxuriating in fan fiction in which your favorite characters don't die and get together in the end makes you happy, you'll never stop. Because why would you? The story makes you happy, and being happy is the only thing that matters, right? And it's not like you're hurting anyone. As this indulgence is indulged, its grip on the mind of the reader and writer becomes strong enough to overwhelm anything else. A fan fiction that meets the specific emotional needs of the reader will always be better than anything on the shelves.
Layne then argues that the issue with modern fanfiction is it's a sign that we never grow up in modern society, which, look, there's a real issue with how nostalgic properties are regurgitated repeatedly to us, right? But that's a complaint with corporations needing easy cash and refusing to embrace new ideas. Fanfiction isn't the problem. Capitalism is. The market's demands for more money, for more thing to sell you. That's the problem. But the idea that this is some symptom of eternal childhood is ridiculous. It's corporate mandated childhood. Key difference there. It's not our fault, it's the company's fault for pushing it on us. People seek new ideas constantly, new stories constantly. That's why Book Talk became a thing, where new writers could promote their works to a bigger audience. But then the corporations got a hold of that too, and made it marketable and easy to monetize.
A fan fiction in which the right character does the right things and says the right things and has the right opinions and has the right things happen to them will absolutely be deemed superior to, say, War and Peace, which I'm sure is probably pretty problematic. I don't know, have we canceled Tolstoy yet? Not that there's not, War and Peace fan fiction.
Remember, with this quote right here, she's complaining about works being canceled for being problematic, but as we saw with her article, some of the works she's defended are novels that were criticized for saying Native Americans were savages, and to which violence is the only solution, which is heinous. Frankly, that's really screwed up. Layne, she can try to obscure that all she wants, but that's what she's complaining about. The works that were taken off shelves because they were really fucked up. And really poorly written, if that wasn't the intended message of the author. It's not like the book shouldn't have been written. She's criticizing authors who listened to feedback, said, oh, crap, you're right, and they took steps to improve the work in response to feedback. I see that as a plus. Yeah, the backlash was intense and a lot, but it was not unjustified. There was a reason people were pissed.
I know what you're thinking. Why is it wrong to be happy? Why is it wrong to pursue something that is in itself not harmful but makes you happy? How is it any different to write a sappy fanfic than it is to write a novel of some other sort? Aren't all writers self-indulgent? No, actually, they're not, and it is different. The difference is that an honest writer who is pursuing self-betterment and excellence knows that sometimes the story needs things that he or she, or the world, doesn't necessarily like a villain who does vile things, or at least things that could potentially get him canceled on social media, like, say, A villain like Loki in the first Avengers making misogynistic remarks to a woman. I remember seeing people on Tumblr really struggling with that and refusing to believe that their beloved Loki would ever do such a thing, even as a villain. Or a hero or heroine who does something wrong and has to try to make it right, like Jane Austen's Emma. Or sometimes a story simply doesn't need the 17-page description of the main character losing her virginity, and so the writer removes it. All of these represent writers not basking in self-indulgence. Instead, choices are made not based on the fantasies and emotional desires of the writer, but on the best way to tell the best story. Please bear in mind, the best story and self-indulgence are somewhat subjective.
Layne then argues that no, it's bad for writers to write stories like the ones that she just described because, well, that will stagnate their personal growth. Even though you know, write that responding to public criticism by engaging with it meaningfully is bad. You argue an author trying to improve their work isn't actively improving themselves? Do I have that right? Is that what you're saying? Because you're getting mad at people for criticizing work, and that criticism is taken to help improve the author's work. So where's the problem here? Hell, I'd argue that writing a work that argues that we can build infrastructure to improve things somewhat actually is more challenging than a simple good guy, bad guy story. I don't know. Maybe dealing with complex cultures is interesting in a narrative, and actually engages a more fleshed out narrative. In fact, you know, it's funny, all of Layne's arguments come across as particularly bizarre when you consider many of the things she cites in her article, like rules on how to engage with different cultures and identities in your writing. She says those are bad. She scoffs at works that people criticize for poor representation, and laughs at how folks online have offered resources to help writers write better, to write more authentically, from a place of knowledge and understanding. And as we'll see later on, it's even more hypocritical, but we'll get to that. Like, she talks about writers being indulgent, yet actively wants to protect writers from resources that can help them learn how to write better. She wants to protect writers from sources of criticism, but say readers are too soft. This, of course, ignores writers like Chinua Achebe, who famously wrote his novel Things Fall Apart due to issues he had with works like Arthur Conrad's Heart of Darkness and his depiction of the people of the Congo. He saw Conrad wrote them as nebulous backgrounds of a white person's story, of a shadow people, and said, hey, these people have a culture, they have a life, they have a world. Let me depict that world fairly, properly, and show that there is a culture of people who do good and bad, who do right and wrong, but exist. They exist. Like all people do. They're not nebulous shadows in someone else's story, but rather people. Those resources exist to help others write people as people and not backdrops to a narrative, not tropes and tools for the writer to immaturely clamber around with. Those resources are useful, and you tell writers that that's bad for them to look at? That it's bad to do further research? That it's bad to dig deeper and understand the topics at hand? And you say that modern education's bad? Food for thought, isn't it? But, you know, Layne cites a few people on Tumblr complaining about Loki being sexist to Black Widow or something. Yeah, that's balance. Yeah. Layne, how about actually, instead of obsessing over what a couple 14-year-olds say on, like, a Tumblr blog in 2012 or whatever, maybe you can actually look at actual authors who were popular on Tumblr at that same time, who engaged in fandom culture and, you know, wrote stories that were challenging. I'm not saying Tumblr is perfect. Tumblr has a lot of problems. It's basically left-wing 4chan right now. But what about authors like Leigh Bardugo or John Green or, you know, authors whose primary audiences are adults? Why are we even comparing Twilight to War and Peace if they were written for completely different audiences? Why are we doing this? What value is there critically in comparing Twilight and its impact to War and Peace and its impact to the audiences divided by 150 fucking years?
A lot of it depends on the specific writer and the specific story. For some writers, giving into their emotional desire to have a happy ending no matter what is what constitutes self-indulgence. For other writers, giving into the emotional desire to have everything be constantly bleak and tragic no matter what is what constitutes self-indulgence. For other writers, having the entire story built around how hot the werewolf CEO is what constitutes self-indulgence. Often, an unbiased, reasonable reader can recognize self-indulgence when they see it. Sometimes what it is a constant battle taking place at the writer's desk.
So wait, Layne, are you basically saying that you have no actual clue what counts as self-indulgence, since it's so flexible? It basically means whatever the fuck you want. Your definition is flexible to the point of uselessness. Layne goes on to cite Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, where apparently McCarthy cut entire scenes of kindness and empathy from the book. And Layne argues this is an act of McCarthy defying his sense of self-indulgence for the audience, writing a better book despite his own wants.
Here's an example. If you look at the earlier versions of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, you'll find that things like heavily emotional scenes had been cut. There's even one scene in which a glimmer of kindness from the kid was completely removed. Keeping them would have indulged McCarthy's own comfort with his characters, his desire to like them in a specific way, or even just inject his own personality or inclinations into his character's behavior. But he was certainly not self-indulgent, so they were cut because he believed that would best serve the story as he was writing it. You tell me if you think the final version was better or worse as a result.
But what did McCarthy say? Well, let's look at it, shall we? Well, let's first look at the quote that was cut out. What did he actually cut? A superfluous paragraph that distracted from the core of what's happening in the action. He didn't cut it because he was self-indulgently wanting to show kindness. He just edited a few words out so the core statement stood out harder. It's not that he cut out emotion. He cut out fluff. You can clearly read what he annexed if you pause. And it's not emotive, it's just words. It's useless, it doesn't add anything to the story. That's why he cut it. It's better off without the paragraph. This isn't a scene, by the way. It's a paragraph that says nothing. Here's the truth. McCarthy wrote most of Blood Meridian in a very quick period of time and then dropped it for 6 months and came back to it. And when he came back to it, he changed stuff because he didn't like it anymore. It's not self-indulgence, it's that he stepped away from the book, didn't think about it, and when he came back, he reevaluated it and felt he needed to change it. Much like how Kiera Drake felt with The Continent. After getting feedback, she changed it. It's almost as if Layne is allergic to people criticizing their own works and realizing what they wrote sucked and they can make it better on their own. Is it self-indulgent to change a work that you wrote yourself because you changed your mind while working on it, I wonder? But no, of course, that's not at all self-indulgent. That's just simply a good writer, denying your self-indulgence by changing what you wrote because you changed your mind. How do you define something that has no definition?
Fanfiction, on the other hand, commodifies specifically the serving of highly personal emotions and desires. And pursuing stories with aspects which are uncomfortable or even, if you'd like, problematic will be seen as the height of discomfort and controversy. There have been, within the fanfiction community, numerous scandals that have arisen over this simple factor. Characters who behaved in uncomfortable ways. And uncomfortable to the fanfiction reader or writer means something that prevents the reader from identifying with the character entirely, or something that prevents the reader from deriving emotional, psychological, or even sexual release from the story. These issues can range from shipping the two wrong characters to writing a male character who somehow takes away the female character's agency, or whatever.
No, Layne, the issue isn't characters behaving in uncomfortable ways. The problem is that some writers write inauthentically. McCarthy, as I'm sure you know because you're a big expert on McCarthy apparently, traveled to the places he was writing about to gain a greater sense of understanding over what he wrote about. He anchored his works in history, in the land. Yet you mock in your article people trying to help writers achieve a similar result to McCarthy, to be more authentic to the source you're writing about. The problem is not that the characters said mean things. The problem is that the author themselves didn't understand the topic they were using. as a point of discussion, and justifiably received criticism from people who did know what they're talking about. And they chose either to learn from it and become better writers, or they don't. There are of course cases of tone policing and unfair attacks, but you didn't cite any. You didn't cite any. You could have talked about the absurdity of anti and pro shippers fighting over what tropes are allowed in fiction arbitrarily, but you didn't. Because I don't think you know about that. Because you'd have to actually understand fanfiction to understand the complex issues in fanfiction culture. All you saw were a couple of writers getting feedback from readers who didn't like their work, and the writer either responding well or responding badly. So who fucking knows, right? But I did neglect to mention one of the examples in her article, which we're going to come to right now, actually.
This has now made it into the literary world, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Books especially find themselves under constant scrutiny. If even a speck of these uncomfortable elements is found, the writers and publishers will be bullied incessantly until the book is pulled. I have several examples on my website, but my favorite is Sparrow and Vine, which was attacked for having a character mention that Elon Musk was good at business.
Of course, Layne's favorite example would be the work that says Elon Musk is good at business, actually. First off, he's not. Elon Musk has failed his way upwards his entire career, but that's another discussion of the day. I actually made a video about that too. But that's not the point. Let's actually look at what happened. Her favorite example that she says is the best example of what she's talking about. What actually happened?
The entire controversy started when people started to receive arcs of her new book, Sparrow and Vine. It is her first traditionally published book that was never indie published, and it's being published through Bloom. And there are two main things that she says in this book where people are like, girl, what the fuck?
So in Sophie Lark's Sparrow and Vine, the main character of the novel says the following.
I was inspired by Elon Musk. I use his 5-step design process.
Now that doesn't sound like saying Elon Musk is good at business, but the main character models herself after Elon Musk. And she's the main character we're supposed to follow. And this was coming out, by the way, in 2025. So it was when Elon Musk was part of the Trump administration. So yeah, I could see a lot of people not liking that because that's controversial. That's politics. And that's going to divide your readership no matter what. But again, I digress. Let's read another snippet, by the way. Let's read one more thing. I'm sure that's the only thing, and there's nothing else people had an issue with.
I don't want to sound ignorant, but shouldn't there be a crew of people with questionable work visas picking these grapes for us?
Yeah, and those are just the two that were popularized by TikTokers. So apparently the publisher actually had issues with that and several other quotes from the book and asked Lark to remove these lines because they were controversial and might alienate her audience, but Lark insisted in keeping them in. She was told by her publisher, by Bloom Books, take these lines out, you're gonna piss people off. And she said no. It's only when pushback came around that she's subjected to the edits she was supposed to write in the first place. So yeah, Layne would defend a book publicly criticized for presenting racism unchallenged. In a romance novel. Not a political propaganda piece, but a romance novel. It was also, again, the publisher's choice to pull the novel from publication to rewrite it. Because the publisher wants to sell a book. And yeah, I know the author said she withdrew it, but the publisher wanted these changes in the first place. You can't tell me the publisher didn't have a hand in this and was saying, well, we told you so. Let's do what we want to do with this work that we are paying you money to write, that we want to make money about, because the publisher at the end of the day wants to make money. Oh, wait, what's that? She used to have indie publishing works. Well, what got into those, I wonder?
However, some of her past books are now coming into conversation. Her book, Stolen Air, there was this quote about Israel and Palestine and comparing it to cats and dogs. And then, in my opinion, what I think is the wildest thing that she has put in a book is from her book, Bloody Heart, which is a Black woman, white man romance. She has this quote in the book. This is from a Goodreads review of this book. He can be my master and I'll be his slave if that's what it takes to get him back. And then, as you can see in the review, it also says that he whips her, which, you are a white woman married to a white man. You have absolutely no place to be writing anything like this.
You're allowed to write whatever you want and publish whatever you want. But if you're publishing through a publishing house, through traditional publishing, then the company you're publishing through wants to make money. Your work is a product to them. I find it baffling how Layne knows this, because she self-published her work. She has freedom to do whatever she wants with her work on her own terms. But she's upset writers pivot their work when making mass marketable material that alienates the mass market. But she loves McCarthy. When McCarthy rewrites his work, it's great. When an author rewrites their work, it's bad. Unless you're McCarthy. If you receive feedback to improve, welcome it with open arms. It's vital to hear different perspectives from your own work if you want your work to appeal to a wider audience. Layne, however, is arguing that you should ignore all of that. Ignore what everyone else thinks. Ignore what they all say to you. Ignore what your publisher and editor knows what common sense tell you. Ignore what the experts of education tell you. Because you gotta write what you want to write. Because it's authentic. I thought that was self-indulgent, Layne, but what the fuck do I know? Because if your intention is to sell books, you need to consider the market you're writing to. And again, it's fucking slimy to frame this controversy as saying, ooh, the author got canceled for saying Elon Musk is a good businessman. Because any moron with Google can look it up and go, oh, you're lying out of your fuck. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I want to apologize to everyone watching just now. That was, I don't know what came over me. That was, what was it, 5 hours later, I guess?
This is why also in books like Morning Glory Milking Farm, you get a page-long monologue from the Minotaur about how hard he's always working to make sure the main character never feels like she doesn't have any agency. This is fan fiction verbiage. This is fan fiction bleeding into mainstream fiction, and I think we can all agree, ruining it.
Layne then complains about a Minotaur monster romance book.
Whoa, hey!
As if this is the face of mainstream publishing, because I've absolutely read this book for sure. It's on my shelf somewhere. Just you know, scroll by, watch all my videos to find it, I guess. Layne, you're looking at an erotic fantasy novel and complaining about this for being an erotic fantasy novel? None of this represents the massive output of published writing. Is this on the New York Times bestseller list? Is this really what the kids are reading? What's the point of this? Also, Layne, something else. You mentioned War and Peace before, right? Well, do you know what War and Peace was about? It was about a social issue. Do you know what Blood Meridian discusses? Social issues. Do you ever stop to think that maybe you're just anchored to your belief system? That your brain melts whenever someone with a different opinion shows up? No, I didn't think so. Self-awareness is not your strongest suit.
The idea that stories must present a world or a situation that perfectly aligns with the writer's specific emotional ideal, especially in abstract areas like agency, are the direct result of writers coming up in fanfiction communities. These communities are populated by young college and high school age people being raised on a steady diet of internet everything, emotion-based reasoning, and political and social bullying of modern society. These young people then take these attitudes into these fanfiction communities where they do all the policing, all the moderating, all the judging and assessing. There is no oversight from literary authorities or even simply people who have a literary framing to their priorities. So these so-called literary fanfiction spaces are entirely built, operated, controlled, and populated by the subset of young people who then indulge together in all their fantasies and desires, sexual and non-sexual. That is, these spaces are perfectly politically and socially safe, according to their own set of ideals and values, while also being entirely permissive.
Layne then argues that fan spaces are created entirely by fans and moderated by fans. This, of course, ignores how the board of the Organization for Transformative Works, the very organization that runs AO3, was founded by people who did become published authors, like Naomi Novik. The current board consists of industry professionals, some of whom work in marketing, law, software, engineering, and translation. Oh, and if you look at many of the fandoms they cite as their favorites, that being the board members, it includes everything from Pride and Prejudice to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. and they all predate Harry Potter, which kind of makes your whole entire argument that the Harry Potter fandom is to blame for this new publishing reality is really limited, doesn't it? A little bit limited. And quite frankly, it is a good thing that fanfiction is a space where you can actually get real responses from real readers in real time. Books aren't read exclusively by publishers or book critics, after all. They're read by readers, and that means having to learn how to take criticism from people. That's an excellent feature. I think every writer should get their ass kicked once or twice by some kid who only half read your story, but really thinks you suck. And they're gonna tell you every reason why they think you suck. It's a fantastic learning experience that will help you take feedback and get a thick skin. Layne, you could learn from that. After all, you're offended by the idea that readers might disagree with you. You're offended that anyone might disagree with your takes on books, what you think high literature is. But rather than take time to self-reflect as to why that might be, you conclude, no, it's the children who are wrong.
These online spaces to these young people quickly become important and valid parts of their formation as people and, crucially, as writers. So then reading and also seeing the rising popularity in these spaces of the types of stories that will necessarily succeed there teaches young writers that good writing means that the story and characters must embody their fantastical ideals for social perfection and can't be too uncomfortable. This discomfort, after all, prevents the story from satisfying emotional fantasies to their utmost. So these discomforts are not only undesirable, they are morally and creatively unjustifiable. That's why in our era, stories in which a fictional character is racist are maligned and canceled because even the presence of such a thing prevents complete immersion in an emotional and psychological fantasyland. That is, it prevents self-indulgence. And these writers are being trained to genuinely believe that getting in the way of total emotional pleasure is bad writing.
Layne, the issue isn't that the characters are being racist. In every instance we've examined, the problem always is that the works endorse the racist ideas. There's the difference. Sinners just came out this year, right? And it features numerous racist characters. And people love this movie. Now, do some writers freak out when their works are mildly criticized? Yeah, sure, of course. But in almost every case we've discussed so far, it's not the character being problematic that's the problem. It's that the work endorses these problematic ideas or never sufficiently pushes back against them. Take this scene from Spike Lee's The BlackKklansman. This scene depicts the head of the Ku Klux Klan looking like a complete moron.
I mean, I can tell that you're a pure Aryan white man from the way you pronounce certain words.
This is a scene that depicts extreme racism, but the guy doing it is clearly an idiot, so it's totally fine. The story pushes against the racism, despite depicting it. In Sinners, the racist characters get shot down because they're racist. That's a good way to push back on it. Not every story has to have an action scene where you shoot up with the KKK, of course, but hey, what are you going to do? Now, this also doesn't mean you have to turn to the reader and say, this character is wrong. But you can show things in the work that contradict the idea, even to a small extent.
Examples like Sparrow and Vine, which was pulled before release after readers online expressed outrage over things said by the characters, are a perfect example of fan fiction writing mentality taking over mainstream culture.
Layne, do you ever consider that you just want to be self-indulgent by refusing to allow racist writing to be critiqued? Like, what value is there to prevent authors from receiving feedback for writing offensive material? If the offensive material is intentional, they don't have to take the feedback. But clearly these writers weren't trying to be offensive with their works. Sounds to me like you don't want people to be challenged.
The author even said when she pulled the release that she would rewrite passages so they wouldn't contribute to harm. That's the kind of thing fan fiction communities train writers and readers to prioritize.
No, the author saying she wanted to avoid contributing to harm isn't fan fiction jargon, it's basic PR jargon. And frankly, I don't buy the author did want to stop contributing to harm, considering what else she's written, as we've discussed.
He can be my master and I'll be his slave if that's what it takes to get him back.
She has a history of this bullshit. I think she just parroted what she thought she should say so she could sell more books. Because, again, the series is being pulled to be rewritten. It's not never coming out. The publisher is just ensuring the author actually incorporates the edits they told her to include in the first place. Because she, like Layne, refused to take their feedback.
But having a, as the writer described, flawed character in this book who expressed admiration for Elon Musk's business strategies was way too uncomfortable for readers, so it had to go. Any writer who gives into this kind of bullying is a coward and lacks all creative integrity. But that's what fanfiction does to you. I feel like I need to tap a sign or something.
The problem is that Layne thinks people have these opinions to fit into social media trends, rather than the truth. That these ideals and perspectives predate the internet, and only are gaining widespread acceptance because the people with these perspectives now have a platform to speak. Traditional publishing presented a singular perspective, one curated by editors, one that had to be verified. Layne fears, I believe, people with different perspectives and ideologies gaining a platform, and people going, you know what? They are right. The idea of own voices scares Layne because that means someone who isn't white, isn't straight, isn't cis, is given a platform on par with their own, and she can't handle that. Don't forget, the English language exists as we know it because different ideologies mesh together across England. Different languages, different cultures, different concepts that were improper merged. What Layne needs is literary perspective to push different voices out. She can't handle a writer that might provide a product other people want to consume that does not conform to her standards.
If the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race, it's also constructed, it's also made, and it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself?
She uses a lot of bullshit words to ultimately say she's mad stories can't be bigoted or else you might anger your readership.
Of course, some select kinds of discomfort can be present, but only if they are tagged with content warnings. This can be anything from vomiting to the presence of food to eye horror to other things I can't mention in a YouTube video. As long as they're in the content warnings, you can usually get away with including uncomfortable elements, but you have to adhere to the content warning system. If you don't, you run the risk of potentially disrupting a reader's sense of comfortable emotional immersion in their fantasy land. And there are few sins higher in the fanfiction community. Why do you think people started demanding trigger warnings on everything?
Then Layne talks about trigger warnings. Great! Everyone's favorite talking point from the conservative convention. By the way, I find it fascinating how she argues fanfiction is too disturbing for her, yet complains about trigger warnings. She literally gets triggered by Minotaur fiction, and as we'll find later on, gets triggered by way more than that.
We have such sights to show you.
Now, of course, emotional and psychological fantasy lands are subjective. So one writer's sexual assault fantasy will be just that fantasy land. And for another writer, it will be a story in which Lady Macbeth and Ophelia run away to open a coffee shop in Finland and talk about how powerful and independent they are while they're in bed or whatever.
Also, that coffee shop comment that Layne made, don't think I missed that there. Are you perhaps jealous that novels like, say, Legends and Lattes became a massive hit? Sounds kind of similar to Legends and Lattes, doesn't it? Or other cozy fantasy and sci-fi stories like the works of Becky Chambers? They're successful because they have an audience they appeal to and they do it well. But what am I talking about? You probably never actually read the books you're complaining about. Also, notice the repulsion in her voice whenever she mentions characters of the same gender going off to be happy together. How she conflates coffee shop AUs and intense smut with her language.
Foreshadowing is a literary device in
What I'm saying is that everyone goes looking for different emotional needs to satisfy, and like other kinds of tastes, these tend to be highly specific. That's why the tag system on sites like AO3 is so robust, and that's where that began for literature. Tags and hyperspecificity like that only occurs when the readers are seeking hyperspecific content to satisfy hyperspecific emotional or sexual needs, and have become accustomed to having those needs neatly labeled and accessible, because that's the whole point of fan fiction. Because here's the thing, yes, there's smut, and that satisfies sexual fantasies and sexual needs. But self-indulgence extends beyond smut, resulting in work that is essentially emotional smut. Its sole function is to allow maximum emotional satisfaction. If you look at the cloud tag on AO3, you can see some of what I'm talking about here. And these are only the most popular tags, so only a fraction of what's available.
Now later on in the video, she's going to argue that fanfiction is corrosive. They're these smutty, repulsive things. But look at the most popular tags here. It's hurt comfort stories. What Layne ignores, of course, is that in order to be comforted, you need to be hurt. The author has a specific point, to offer escapism, but to also provide something to contrast that escapism, to make it valuable to the reader. Pain. That right there kills Layne's entire point about her fanfiction avoiding any troubling topics, doesn't it? It's clear from that yes, fanfiction does push the audience's buttons. It does explore topics that are challenging. These works do engage with troubling themes of the works themselves, but do so in a way to bring emotional catharsis to the reader at the end.
Let's ignore for now the plethora of disturbing sexual tags. By the way, what I've blurred here is stuff that I think I might not be allowed to show in a YouTube video. Feel free to go to the site yourself if you want to see the whole image. But let's look mainly at these other tags that signify a work that satisfies a specific emotional need or hunger. We can see hugs, happy ending, comfort, cuddling and snuggling, feelings, praise, kink, protectiveness, self-esteem, and so on.
She blurred a few tiny little tags here and there and highlighted, snuggling? Praising? Protectiveness? Really? You're going to ignore all of the hugely popular tags to highlight the praise kink stuff? That's what you're worried about. You're worried about people being praised a little bit. This is the degradation of modern literature, people snuggling.
And we can also see tags that are meant to satisfy the reader's and writer's emotional need to see themselves represented, such as autism spectrum, LGBTQ, reader insert, gender themes, and so on. What a lot of people don't realize is that the need for emotional satisfaction, especially among young women, is almost as strong, if not stronger, than the need for sexual satisfaction, and can bring about a bizarrely specific array of subgenres and tastes, comparable to, sexual entertainment things.
Wait, are you angry? People want to see themselves in stories? To hear stories that are linked to their life experiences in some way? Oh, who am I kidding? Of course she is. She's conflated writers writing stories about autistic and LGBTQIA characters with stories where characters get hugs, and conflated both of those to smut, all while ignoring the most popular tags in the site. Actually, I might have lied to you just now, because now Layne is talking to you about Whump.
Let me give you an example. Show of hands, how many people know what I'm talking about when I say the word Whump? Don't worry, I'm going to tell you. Whump, an old onomatopoeia for something like a solid body slam in comics, is the term that has come to refer to emotionally or sexually satisfying physical harm to characters. That is, scenes and stories in which a character is hurt in some way will produce emotional satisfaction in the audience. Don't get me wrong, this isn't always satisfaction that the character got hurt like some kind of sadism. It can be, but not as a rule. This is more the emotional release of the physical harm and, crucially, the comfort that comes after. The emotional satisfaction comes more from the comfort than the hurt itself, so the hurt is satisfying because it presents the promise of future comfort, if that makes sense. Needless to say, there's a large subgenre of fanfiction focused on Whump. This is often called merely hurt comfort. You can also see it in these other tags, such as angst, that would be emotional Whump, anxiety, self-harm, trauma, torture, medical injury, crying, comfort, and so on.
Oh, so you didn't ignore all the hurt comfort stuff. You just buried the lead a little bit, is that right? Oh, okay, that's fair enough too.
This emotional need, once identified, became an object of indulgence. This fan-made, publicly available, highly detailed spreadsheet focusing primarily on Western media provides timestamps and descriptions for Whump scenes in movies and shows, and has over 15,000 entries. On Tumblr, you can find hundreds of users who make Whump lists for movies and shows and books. Moreover, there's physical Whump and emotional Whump, and this can be even further broken down. Gunshots your thing? We've got Whump for that. You prefer a nice head cold? We've got that too. How about torture, grief, crying, chains, handcuffs, stabbings, non-consensual stuff? Why do you want it? Which, by the way, is all with male victims.
She says this as if it hasn't been a component of storytelling since the days of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. All stories create contrast between pain and comfort to explore the various shades of the human experience. This is just a case of people talking about that process, maybe a little bit immaturely, maybe they're discovering tropes for the first time, and maybe they find these scenes emotionally meaningful to themselves. Whether you're discussing academically or in terms created by a 14-year-old, it's still talking about the same topic. People discussing the mechanisms of fiction.
What does this indulge exactly? It depends on the reader or writer. For some, it is absolutely sexual, and so the story will even veer into smut territory. For many, though, it's entirely emotional and fulfills some attention fantasy or caregiving fantasy, or what have you, of the writer or reader. Some will say that it's therapeutic, which is probably often true, but that's therapy, not literature. And a good therapist would probably caution against a constant, ever-increasing indulgence in works that could potentially re-traumatize the reader or writer.
The fact that Layne acts like it's so bizarre that people find therapeutic comfort in story, exploring the human experience, is baffling. Do you think Jane Austen was unaware that readers enjoy watching characters being nursed back to life? So when she started Pride and Prejudice, and early on, Mr. Bingley is nursing Jane Bennet back to life. Hell, Mrs. Bennet basically capitalizes on this. She sends her daughter running through the rain, knowing it will get her sick, knowing she'll get stuck at the Bingley's place, and knowing Mr. Bingley will take care of her.
If Jane should die of this fever, it would be comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders.
Like, you've read these books, you should know this. We've known about this for hundreds of years. We've been writing stories about it, aware of this human conditional trend for hundreds of years. But because a 20-year-old on Tumblr, on a 20-year-old blog, makes a gift set of Sherlock and Watson or whatever, that's the end of literature. That's the end right there. By showing audiences responding to a thing the authors wanted them to respond to, it's bad, apparently. This is such a nothing burger of a topic.
Of course, and this is a closely related issue, this notion that a writer's therapy session, even if it is beneficial to the writer, ought to then also be published for everyone else to read is both a very non-literary notion and is a direct result of fanfiction's nefarious, poisonous influence on the minds of writers, and is, in a sense, the absolute height of self-indulgence.
What are you talking about with therapeutic writing being the opposite of literary? Sylvia Plath's entire body of work was her processing her emotions. Edgar Allan Poe channeled his fear of death and fear of being buried alive into his writing. Mary Shelley almost single-handedly created the entire genre of science fiction and horror because she was bored during a party with friends and wanted to make something that would liven things up a little bit.
Interestingly, very few of these fictions and infatuations feature female characters getting hurt. Feel free to discuss that one amongst yourselves.
How would you know that these hurt comfort fics rarely feature female characters, when the only example of fanfiction that you wrote about was a Princess Leia fic? You showed a bunch of other tags. You didn't demonstrate for a second you actually read anything from these tags. Oh, or you studied even a single one of the examples you cited. But I'm sure if I go through the list, I'll find nothing but men. That clearly there's only men in these entire blogs, right? To show how little Layne actually reviewed her own data, I went onto Whumpipedia myself, and literally at the beginning of the movie section, I found Jennifer Lopez. Like, yeah, it's mostly men, but they are women here. You just can't search it easily because it's not divided by gender on this list.
The bottom line here is that fanfiction has, for some time, been specifically and prominently a vehicle for the indulgence of highly specific emotional or sexual needs and fantasies. As these fanfiction writers grew up while failing to mature and broke into the mainstream, of course this attitude came with them. The thing with self-indulgence is that self-betterment as an author or writer of any kind is no longer what is important, but rather self-representation. The story has to, in every way, represent the specific ideals, desires, fantasies, politics, opinions, and aesthetics that the author values most. More than this, the story and characters have to represent the author the most. In a word, the story has to represent the author's identity.
Why do you argue that self-treatment is diametrically opposed or mutually exclusive to self-representation? Are you implying it was ethically bad for Tony Kushner to write Angels in America, a representation of what gay adults went through during the AIDS crisis? Do you think it was ethically immoral of Chinua Achebe to present an accurate depiction of culture in the Congo in Things Fall Apart after its centuries of literary negligence on that part? Are you under the impression that writing a story about different people is not self-betterment? If you don't have an actual answer, then why the hell did you present these two concepts as mutually exclusive?
I've had people send me messages telling me that fanfiction is incredibly important because it allows representation and for them to identify with the characters. Fran Lebowitz is someone with whom I seldom agree. However, a lot of her opinions on books and readers and writers do have a strong note of truth to them, but never more so than when she said this: "A book is not supposed to be a mirror, it's supposed to be a door." She's absolutely right. The function of reading is not to find yourself perfectly represented in the characters and their environments. The function of reading is to explore other people, other ideas, other environments, other circumstances. You have full and constant access to your own mind. A book or any story is supposed to broaden your mind. How can it do that if it's just you replicated over again? If you want to see yourself, look in a mirror. That is not the function of a story.
Fran Lebowitz is quoted here, but here's the problem here, Layne. If the point of reading is to find other ideas, other environments, and other worldviews, then why the hell are you opposed to reading those other views yourself? You complain that your worldviews aren't reflected back at you in every book you've read, and you refuse to take those works on their own terms. You reject every writer who dares write from a different perspective, not to provide a mirror for themselves, but a door for you to travel. A door for you to see more from. You only want all books to be mirrors for which you can see yourself. You act like these stories are self-indulgent when, in reality, they're offering you a door to see the world from their perspective. And you're completely rejecting it because you'd rather walk in a hall of mirrors. Your own quote proves while your entire philosophy is superficial at best.
Self-indulgent, self-representing fanfiction isn't literature. It isn't even in itself valuable storytelling. All it is the mirror of the author, and therefore only has value to the author. And that value itself is fleeting and limited because all the author has done with it is presented in some limited form the contents not of his or her own mind, but of his or her limited specific emotional or sexual fantasy land.
You dismiss works that are sexual fantasy lands when you won't actually read said works, so you have no idea what the works are. You reject these stories without ever engaging with what they have to say because you think society peaked during the Black Plague.
We see this now in mainstream media with the epidemic of self-insert characters, whether it's video game makers creating or changing characters to look just like them.
And then she goes into complaining about video games. And here's where the video becomes ridiculous. This is where Layne goes full grifter, complaining about Mary Jane Watson in the new Spider-Man 2 game, by taking the most unflattering shot of Mary Jane in the entire game and comparing it to, well, actually, who are you comparing it to? The person in the photo is the writer of Spider-Man 2, someone who had no involvement in design or any impact on how Mary Jane Watson looked. It's the same face model as the previous game. Her face just looks different because several years have passed between games. Again, the writer had no impact on game design, art, or anything for the game, so this is pretty ridiculous. In fact, this particular campaign against the face model for Mary Jane resulted in mass harassment. So I guess Layne is advocating that we shame the appearance of women now, for looking this way. They modeled a character after a real woman. That's her face, it's a real person. There's no singular author of a video game, it's a collaborative effort. So who's the person who's being selfish here?
Or Rebecca Yarros writing a Mary Sue heroine who has the same medical condition she has.
Oh, and by the way, I don't like Fourth Wing. I can't believe I'm having to defend Rebecca Yarros here, but the problem with Fourth Wing isn't that the main character has a physical disability, like Yarros does. That's actually one of the better parts of the story. It actually gives her main character some dimension. The problem is, unlike how Leigh Bardugo did it with Kaz in Six of Crows, giving him a disability where he still has other elements to it that inhibits him, that restricts him at times, but he still works around it, works through it. The disability in Fourth Wing doesn't connect to the story's conflict, or even the character's conflict. Find me a reason why it's bad a character has this ability to work, especially when authors write tons of other characters who aren't disabled.
Or a lesbian author making all of her sapphic heroines the most powerful, brilliant, wisest characters in the story.
Remember when Layne said that fiction's not supposed to be a mirror? Because she clearly hates doors to perspectives that don't belong to her.
Of course, you're more than welcome to, as they say, write what you know, but this isn't that. People who indulge in this self-identity in their fiction are doing so partly out of that self-indulgence and that overall inflated sense of self-importance, but it also has to do with the entire attitude towards identity in fanfiction. Not only are writers expected to put self-insert characters in one form or another into their stories, they are also just as often altering existing characters to more closely resemble themselves. As in, for example, lesbian writers who make fanfiction in which the canon straight female characters are in a lesbian relationship, such as Arwen and Éowyn.
No, Layne, not all fanfiction is self-insert. You have no idea what you're talking about. In fan communities, there's a growing tension about self-insert characters, or characters who are out of character. It's a wide point of critique with the fandom community that has been going on for some time. And it's not a new thing, Layne. This isn't news. I noticed that you mentioned the term Mary Sue just now.
Or Rebecca Yarros writing a Mary Sue heroine who has the same medical condition she has.
You know the origin of the term Mary Sue? You know about it, right? It's fanfiction. The character is a parody of self-inserts from the 70s. In Star Trek, what you're complaining about is using the terms of fandom to imply that no one critiques the fandom. You're taking a term fandom created to critique itself and pretending that doesn't happen. And this is a term older than we are. Also, Layne seems really hung up on lesbians, writing stories about lesbians. I'm sure this isn't reflective of any perspectives at all.
Foreshadowing is a literary device and...
Of course, if the writer isn't a lesbian, this might not be as well received by the readers. This goes further, too, with really hot-button social issues being inserted into fanfictions, such as HIV. Writing such a story while not actually being HIV positive yourself is something of a fanfiction faux pas. A strange phenomenon of fanfiction is the unwritten, soft rule that you can't write what you aren't. This extends to disabilities, diseases, and various specific sexual orientations and gender identities and so forth. If that isn't you, then writing it dominantly in your story isn't always entirely permissible, which is why people who aren't, say, Black or Hispanic will get in trouble nowadays for writing books with characters who are. Just another example of fanfiction helping to change the rules.
Also, Layne, you do realize that people can lie on the internet, right? That own voices tags exist only to show you're writing from a place of authenticity, but you could just lie about having HIV or being a lesbian, and no one is actually going to know the difference until you're caught lying about it, which happens quite frequently. Also, let me give you a perspective here. John Green's famous novel, The Fault in Our Stars, is about a girl dying of cancer. It was widely popular on its release during the heyday of you being on Tumblr. While Tumblr eventually did get too much for John Green, again, Tumblr is a cesspool of horror, the likes of which we've never seen before, the novel The Fault in Our Stars is not widely criticized for representing terminally ill people poorly. What is criticized, though, are the various cyclic novels that came after The Fault in Our Stars to capitalize on the book's success, for exploiting the imagery that novel incorporates superficially. See, what people are mad about isn't representation. If that were the case, then Avatar: The Last Airbender would have been cancelled by now, as opposed to being one of the most beloved cartoons of all time, because it was made by white guys. No, the issues that gain traction outside of a few randos online complaining about nonsense are when the works are bad or superficial. Layne is actively arguing that badly written books shouldn't be criticized, but thoughtfully, well-researched works trying to communicate different ideas and perspectives should be banned on site. They don't believe me? Just wait till the end.
Foreshadowing is a literary device and
it's not even remotely surprising that all across media now, writers and artists are inserting themselves into their stories. Why wouldn't they? That's how they engage with stories, by inserting themselves into them, or even altering existing characters to become them. That's how fanfiction has trained them and the rest of society now to think it is supposed to be. So yes, of course they're shamelessly making video game characters who look just like them. Of course they're making their main characters have the exact same illnesses or disabilities or personality as they do. All of this is the most natural thing in the world to a fanfiction reader and writer.
I don't think the problem, Layne, is that fanfiction writers are writing themselves into works. The problem, Layne, is, to use your own quote, you can't see yourself in the work. If you can't see yourself in the work, you yourself can't engage with it. Your problem isn't that the writers are selfish. The problem is you're a selfish reader. Then she complains about smut, because Layne can't handle anyone talking about smut ever, actually.
Let's take a moment now to talk about the one thing about fanfiction that everyone, especially those not in the community, most associate with fanfiction. Smut. A lot of people took issue with my joking comment comparing sites like AO3 to OnlyFans, saying, no, there are non-sexual fanfictions, that's just incredibly dishonest and horrible. Seriously, you would not believe the number of messages I got scolding me about this. But here's the thing they apparently missed. OnlyFans has a non-explicit user base. 20% of OnlyFans users are not NSFW, and that number is going up. Yet if a lady said to you, yeah, I have an OnlyFans, my guess is the first thing you think of is not going to be a cooking channel. Like it or not, fanfiction has exactly the same reputation. If I was being extremely generous, I could say that 20% of fanfiction isn't smut of the strict observance. Let's put aside stories with random sex scenes and all that very extreme emotional onanism of hurt, comfort, etc. I would also like to point out that a lot of writers and readers think that as long as the scene doesn't involve, how to put this, the plug going into the socket, then it's not smut. So the characters can do all the other stuff, and there's a solid chance it won't get labeled sexual or explicit. So okay, let's give them 20% non-sexual content, just like OnlyFans.
Layne argues that AO3 has the same reputation as OnlyFans. Let that sink in. The same reputation as OnlyFans. She claims 20% of OnlyFans users are not NSFW, and then argues that same proportion applies to AO3. There's just one problem here. We saw the tags. They give you how many fics are for each tag. The smut tag on AO3 contains around 960,000 fics. Now, this sounds massive until you remember the site has over 16 million fics on it, meaning smut doesn't even comprise 1/10 of the site. Yet, Layne's trying to argue that 20% of fics on AO3 are the only ones that aren't NSFW. So you assume there are 12.8 million fanfiction on that website that are erotic or smutty that aren't labeled as smut. So what you're arguing is under 10% of all erotic fanfiction on AO3 are not tagged, and that no one's talking about it. You know, maybe you shouldn't complain about modern education when you can't do basic math or exercise basic reasoning. Do you really think that the group you're saying polices their own work religiously, zealously, would allow 12 million fics to go unmoderated or unpoliced if you yourself claim that the community is hyper-vigilant, policing their own work to make sure it conforms to the systems of the website? Do you realize how crazy that sounds, that the moderators at AO3 would allow so many fics to have the incorrect tags on them for so long, or that users wouldn't complain about it?
Yet, when you talk about fanfiction in a crowded room, the vast majority of people in that room will think primarily of smut and probably assume that that smut is pretty perverted.
Yes, that room people might think about smut, but we've just proven smut barely comprises a fraction of what fanfiction are written. So those people are wrong!
Here's the reality. Regardless of how many truly, genuinely non-sexual fanfiction works there may be out there, the specific nature of the smut that has deluged bookstores in recent years is the direct offspring of fanfiction smut, which is to say that fanfiction is directly responsible for that phenomenon.
No, Layne. It's not directly responsible. 50 Shades of Grey is responsible, and yes, it did start as fanfiction, yes, but by the time it was published, it was no longer fanfiction. After that, you had Sarah J. Maas, who, as you proved before, didn't write fanfiction.
I can't look most of my family in the eye now. My first on-the-page sex scene was in my Court of Thorns and Roses, the first novel in that series. When the second book in my ACOTAR series came out, A Court of Mist and Fury, that one like really stepped up the steam. And so I called her. I was like, Grandma, you know I love you and I appreciate that you read everything that I've ever put down on paper, but maybe skip this one. And she's like, well, why, Sarah? I'm like, well, Grandma, there's a lot of like really steamy, sexy material. She just goes, well, that sounds right up my alley.
But no. Layne wants to bring up Harry Potter as the reason why we have modern erotic writing.
Do you remember what I said about Harry Potter, that it was the series that launched 1,000 ships? The reality, at least here in the West, I'm not sure about the East, is that shipping is the core function and draw of writing and reading fanfiction. This was always true. But Harry Potter sent the popularity of shipping in fanfiction to heights never before seen in the West. If you take the inherently self-indulgent nature of the fanfiction community, combine that with the inherently romantic nature of fanfiction in general, and then combine that with the extremely permissive and shame-averse nature of modern society, you'll get a perfect storm of cultural and psychological conditions that will result in a whole host of young writers, especially young female writers, indulging every imaginable sexual fantasy in their fanfiction writing. This ranges from simple sex scenes involving canon couples to wildly, wildly disturbing torture and abuse stories that are hundreds of thousands of words long, that include themes that are so insanely horrifying and perverted that I literally can't show them to you.
We have such sights to show you.
And Layne cites some disturbing fic that deeply bothered her.
Let me put it to you this way. I've done all the dark romantasy, you know, the haunting Adeline and Dead Inside, and yet I was still somehow shocked and disturbed by what I found on AO3, which stories, by the way, were not obscure works tucked deep in the bowels of the site. These were stories with millions of views.
Now, first off, millions of views. It has a little over 1 million views, which sounds like a lot, but that does not mean that these are unique readers. These are only the total number of hits the fanfiction got across 35 chapters. Many of these clicks are from repeat viewers, clicking the fic multiple times as it's updated. So this statistic is misleading. It really doesn't show how popular the works are on a long-term basis. But you're probably wondering, what disturbed Layne this much? Well, guess what? I looked up the fic. It's an erotic gore fic. It's gross, graphic, disgusting. And yeah, that's extreme. I can't argue with you in that one. It is disgusting. But Layne, It's a dead dove fic. What did you expect? The reason they are tagged as dead dove fics is because the vast majority of people don't actually want to read them. Because they're so repulsive that you really don't want to engage with them. You are given warnings multiple times. Do not read. If you read this, you are getting exactly what you're told it is. You complained so much about trigger warnings, yet deliberately went out of your way to avoid a trigger warning, and then complained you got triggered.
No, I don't know what I expected.
Also, it's a fic for Bungo Stray Dogs, a seinen manga for adults that has violence in it. I just have to ask, what did you expect there to be? It's really like picking up Clive Barker's Books of Blood and going, I can't believe these books had blood in them.
A lot of the best-selling authors we see on the shelves of bookstores these days are merely smutty fanfiction imports. Twilight was Harry Potter fanfiction, then E.L. James wrote Twilight fanfiction, that became 50 Shades of Grey. Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instruments series is also Harry Potter fanfiction.
Oh, so Layne does know about Cassandra Clare, and is insisting that Twilight is still Harry Potter fanfiction, when we all know it's not. So she's not confusing Twilight with the Mortal Instruments like I maybe was generously thinking she would. No, she just doesn't know the difference.
Ali Hazelwood's The Love Equation is Star Wars fanfiction, in which Rey and that emo bratty edgelord are the shipped relationship, and so on and so on and so on forever. And many of the romantasy and romance writers who are big today will proudly talk about how they came up in fanfiction. Given the nature of fanfiction, what's popular, what gets hits, and what doesn't, most of these writers clearly learned the law of the fanfiction jungle and applied that to their literary pursuits. And that meant maximum smut equals maximum sales. And because fanfiction readers are also book readers, that actually works, sadly.
Also, are you implying that the borderline sexless Twilight, the Mortal Instruments, and the Love Hypothesis are smutty works on par with 50 Shades of Grey? Layne, those 4 books are so vastly different in terms of erotic content and style that they're incomparable. Like, genuinely, did you read these books? The Love Hypothesis has a singular brief sex scene in it. The first books in the Twilight series and the Mortal Instruments, however, have no sex scenes in them, and 50 Shades of Grey is almost entirely sex scenes. Are you saying that these 4 works have the same amount of smut in them? That they're equally smutty? If not, why compare them? Sarah J. Maas, Rebecca Yarros, those are the 2 biggest names in romantasy right now, and neither have a history of fanfiction writing.
And in the fanfiction jungle, what makes a story popular? Incorporating a popular ship? Yeah. Incorporating a popular and slightly unique twist on a trope, such as the alternate universe trope? Okay, maybe. Appealing to a particular subset of fanfiction readers, such as the hurt comfort crowd? Possibly. But if you want to take the easy road, all you really have to do is pack in a lot of sex.
This again ignores how the most popular fics are hurt comfort and not smut. And even then, smut does not include sex necessarily. But sure, let's see where you have to go with this. Layne?
Many commenters and some people who sent me messages regarding my romantasy video a while back told me personal anecdotes of how they tried to write stories that didn't have sex in them and got like no hits and no readers. And then one little micro story with an explicit scene was 100 times more popular almost overnight. And as we already discussed in that video, once you start to feed that hunger, it grows.
Layne takes the same approach to smut in fanfiction that Ronald Reagan took to marijuana. Once you start, you seek out spicier, heavier stuff. And Layne's about to take this to incredibly dishonest levels throughout the rest of her video. I want to warn you right now, this is where Layne goes from simply being against smut in fiction to downright criminal fear-mongering.
On the screen right now, I have a list of some of the tags on AO3 as well as the number of stories that include that tag. This gives you an idea of what I mean when I say feeding the hunger makes it grow.
Layne shows a bunch of tags here that are admittedly extremely taboo subjects, and I'm not going to touch those with a 10-foot pole. They're also not reflective of the greater community of AO3. They comprise a tiny number in relation to the vast scheme of things as a whole, and many of these fics have become the subject of controversy themselves within each fandom. There's a reason why people point to Stockholm as the point where Lily Orchard proved she is a predator. And so if your argument is a trend in AO3, you're wrong, it's not a trend. If your segment is that AO3 audiences embrace the subject of these tags, you are also wrong.
Because I try to take research very seriously, I've tried to read a few less extreme of these stories. Stories I thought probably weren't going to be all that bad. You know, after what I read when I did my research for the Romantasy video. Let's just say my recovery is ongoing. If you ever want to lose all hope in the future of humanity and the literary world, go to the AO3 tag, Dead Dove Do Not Eat. Actually, no, don't do that. I did that and it didn't take very long to start feeling nauseous and incredibly disturbed and depressed.
Who are you? Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some, angels to others.
The reason the Dead Dove tag exists is that you don't read them. What the hell were you expecting? Also, it should be noted, some of these topics are trigger warnings because the fic deals with dark subject matter and are not necessarily erotic. Unfortunately, I'm not going to find out which ones are which because I don't want to touch these fics with a 10-foot pole. That grosses me out too much. But you seem to want to make general statements about them. I remember a system recently where the tagging system of novels tagged The Bluest Eye with incest and violence and all that, and the novel was banned from schools as a result of that. I explored this topic very thoroughly in a previous video of mine. I'm reminded of a story I read about a few years ago where the graphic novel series Heartstoppers, one of the most popular graphic novels of the 2010s and early 2020s, was challenged in a Mississippi library. Because when reading how the book got banned, I see the entire insidious play to get these books off shelves in miniature. And I'm going to tell you all about it because I think this one story tells you how the process works. How it started was a complaint was filed by a woman named Heather McMurray, who complained the books were explicit and in the kids section. A meeting was held where only people who opposed the book were there. Those in favor of the ban showed up and no one else knew it was happening. I should note that yes, public notices were issued that it was going to be a discussion, but how many of you actually know what public discussions are happening right now in your local library? I bet maybe 5 of you said you know. The rest of you have no clue. So even if they were a couple of flyers placed in your library in like the entranceway, do you actually look at those? Do you just walk right past them? It was in plain sight, but no one noticed because why would you look for it? Why would you assume to look at your library notifications waiting for someone to challenge a book? And so the books were taken away. Parents who went to the library regularly noticed the books were missing, and most of them, in virtue of their kids being left without a book they really liked, filed a complaint to put the books back on shelves. Journalists at the time quoted people who came to the meeting to get their opinions as to why they wanted to get this book off shelves so desperately. Many people at this meeting claimed it was against God's will, that Heartstoppers was against the will of God, and was being used to recruit kids into the gay lifestyle by presenting characters, I guess. Heather herself argued that the book Heartstoppers was essentially smut, explicit smut. Now, I've actually read Heartstoppers, and if you have read Heartstoppers, which, by the way, personal opinion here, it's not that good a book. It's whatever. You know, it's a very whatever comic. I'm not a big fan of it. The book is not explicit. It's basically Hallmark for teens. The worst you get is they hold hands or kiss once. Hallmark is more smutty than this book. I think of all the quotes, though, it's this one that sells the whole game, in my opinion. Heather argued that the media was focused on Heartstoppers, but the real issue was the entire young adult section. All of it. That all books of a explicit nature should be removed from the kids section. Mind you, the books for older teens are counted as the kids section. It's very infantilizing, I guess, you know, because of course a 4-year-old and a 16-year-old, they have the same reading material, right? By the way, she said sexually explicit. In this case, sexually explicit meant I guess spicy hand-holding, or, you know, whatever, or blushing at each other. It shouldn't surprise you that most of these people who banned the book never even read the book. In fact, a majority of them hadn't even heard the book existed. Rather, they used databases to indicate what books should be banned and acted accordingly based on details given by these databases. Heather, in particular, cited a database called BookLook that told them that Heartstoppers was explicit. Never even read the book, but it was on a database, so therefore it must be true. By the way, BookLook also argued the novel The Hate U Give was another explicit book. The Hate U Give is a book about systemic racism and police brutality, and it was written at the height of the BLM movement. BookLook says that The Hate U Give contains inflammatory racial commentary, excessive profanity, and sexual activities. A book written about a teen grappling with racially motivated police shooting is inflammatory, apparently, even though that was what was happening in the news at that time, and teens would want a book to articulate the concerns they might have had about their own community or even their own safety.
Basically, we don't want them to think. We don't want them to ask questions. You know, we just want their lives to be perfect. Well, that's not possible because lives are not perfect and kids have a lot going on and you can't control that.
You see what I mean here? Kids who read Heartstoppers discussed what the book meant to them. Many of them were violently bullied in school for maybe being gay or being outcasts, and a couple even said of being taken out of school because the bullying was just that intense. The book was their lifeline, a way of them feeling they weren't alien or weird. And now, those books are banned, so they have nothing else. At least, nothing to make them feel a sense of community within a community that already hates them. And if you're thinking, oh, it's just books, you're being dramatic, well, think again. Because the methods being used to ban books are being used to ban way more than just books. It's very odd how that works out, isn't it?
Sometime later, I happened to see a thread on one of the AO3 forums complaining about members of the fanfiction community who found that particular tag's contents too disturbing. If you don't like it, don't read it, they said. And also, golly, it's like we can't have anything bad happen to our characters. Sure, yes, if you don't like it, don't read it. But it's hard to see the things that are in there and not become incredibly concerned about the people writing and reading those stories.
But yeah, Layne, if someone tells you don't read, don't read it. It's that simple. You shouldn't read something that disturbs you. That's why they tell you that. Further, I find it fascinating how you complain so much about how fanfiction doesn't challenge its readers, yet now you're complaining about fics that challenged you, and challenged you so deeply that you needed recovery time after reading them. It seems to me like you're being hypocritical. If you're talking about general trends across fanfiction culture, then focusing in on the smallest percentage of fics is ridiculous. And even more so, it's disingenuous.
The perversion factor, as with adult content across the board, intensifies over time. We've already talked about this a lot in my video on Smut, but the same applies. However, because sites like AO3 are built on absolute permissiveness, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's about 1,000 times worse. As bad as some published dark romance books truly are, they are as tame as Mary Poppins compared to what you can effortlessly find on AO3. And all of this increasingly weird and increasingly perverted stuff is all filtering through to the mainstream. All these weird monster and animal smut books like Morning Glory Milking Farm, those trends started in fanfiction. And because, as we can clearly see from the aforementioned literary masterpiece, fanfiction now feeds popular literary culture.
Those trends are actually way older than that. The Academy Award-nominated film Beauty and the Beast is a monster romance story. And later, they gave The Shape of Water, a monster erotic romance, Best Picture. Simply put, fanfiction didn't create monster romance. Monster romance always existed, and fanfiction became an outlet for a cultural fascination that has existed for centuries, if not millennia.
It will only be a matter of time before the most disturbing thing I saw in Dead Dove Do Not Eat is sitting happily on the shelf at your local bookstore.
Also, Layne, the thing you read in the Dead Dove tag does exist on your bookshelf. It's called splatterpunk. It's a literary genre that has existed since the 80s, pioneered by writers like Clive Barker. Or hell, Chuck Palahniuk's Haunted. I bet you've never read Chuck Palahniuk's Haunted.
Something I want to talk about related to the smut-pocalypse is a topic that never seems to get any less strange to me, and that is BL.
Wait, hold on a second. What topic was it that you had an issue with again there, Layne?
BL is short for boys' love. It's gay romance, almost always gay smut, between two male characters, which has a disproportionately large female audience.
Oh, but surely Layne isn't going to say something incredibly bigoted right now, right?
Of course, BL is a little different from any other run-of-the-mill gay storyline. This particular hyper-specific subgenre got its start in Japan. Thanks, Japan. Its earliest form was, surprise, surprise, fanfiction. Specifically, fanfiction written by straight women featuring two young men, usually exceptionally beautiful young men, not so much masculine as somewhat androgynously beautiful. If you've ever wondered why so many romantasy writers refer to their male leads as beautiful men,
so Layne argues that the BL subgenre started in fanfiction written by straight women. This is, inaccurate, we'll say. Modern BL manga can be traced back to the 70s, with manga like In the Sunroom, which isn't fanfiction at all, it's a shoujo manga. However, this ignores the longer history of the affiliated Class S fiction genre, a literary subgenre from Japan about women forming homosocial relationships. That dates back to 1920, or the 1920s, I should say.
Needless to say, this has a tremendously loyal female fan base bordering on feral. This is books, comics and manga, anime, and live-action dramas. BL as a genre sees its popularity fed by fanfiction, particularly gay shipping fanfiction, which in turn feeds the popularity of BL. This is a constant loop that has led to an explosion of popularity in the East and the West.
But even then, Layne, what's your issue with BL? They're just romance stories centered on two men. That's it. What's your personal issue here exactly? You yourself said that fiction should be a door, not a mirror, right? So why do you expect literature to primarily reflect back your own life experience? Why is it bad that the main character is gay? What's wrong with that? Why couldn't you just read a story about that topic? Why are you so repulsed by it? So wait, BL influenced romantasy. Romantasy is destroying Western media. Therefore, BL is destroying Western media, an invasive genre from the East? That sounds xenophobic if you ask me, but what do I know?
And when it comes to Western popularity, BL is the subgenre of Eastern media, books, manga, dramas, etc., that is enormously popular with women. Most Western women I've come across who watch Eastern media include a huge amount of BL in the rotation. With, it seems, the majority of female fans, that's the popular Eastern media here in the West.
Did Layne just say that she blames anime, like Yuri on Ice, for the downfall of Western civilization? You did, didn't you? I don't think you knew what Yuri on Ice is because you have no knowledge of anime, but you kind of implied it. Also, watching Layne struggle to describe the dynamics of yaoi is fucking hilarious.
One of these beautiful men is the, how should we put this? Submissive half of the relationship, while the other retains a more traditionally dominant masculine role in the relationship, if you get what I'm saying.
You think she was describing something repugnant, not something so widely known that Lucky Star, a show for teenagers, was making jokes about it 20 years ago.
Gowron's really sticking it to Sosuke.
These are such old jokes that we used to have these jokes at anime cons all over the place with the yaoi paddle.
I was made aware of the existence of this subgenre when I first started to develop an interest in Eastern media as opposed to modern Western media.
Here, Layne admits she's a tourist who only recently discovered yaoi exists. So you're talking about Western perspectives and forcing them into a genre that has existed for decades before your birth. And now you misrepresent that genre's history to your audience to satisfy your own interests. And then you conflate fanfiction with actual manga and novels written with the intention of being BL.
They read BL novels and comic translations, and they heavily ingest BL and gay shipping fanfiction. In fact, if you go to Barnes & Noble and have a little browse through their translated Chinese novels section, I would bet you folding money that you wouldn't be able to find one that isn't BL. In fact, my efforts to find unofficial fan translations of published novels from Japan and China has turned up an interesting issue in the Western fan community for Eastern media. The majority of what you'll find fan translated is either explicitly BL or it can be interpreted as BL. That is, either fans ship the main male characters so hard that to them it's actually canon, or the novel was deliberately written to be very ambiguous in that regard. And the quality of the works does not matter, provided emotional or sexual needs are satisfied by the story. So people who are apparently more like me and just want to find a good book tend to lament this fact, saying that no one ever translates any Eastern novel unless it's BL, or one could say BL coded. I've heard this called BL brain rot.
Layne argues that BL novels are bad, apparently, and that works that even contain BL implications are not good. What a load of shit this is.
Speaking of which, recently I got a comment on my video on romantasy. I tried to find it to show you, but after 3 hours of hunting, my eyeballs were about to fall out of my head. This comment was calling me a hypocrite for being critical of the explosion of smut in literature considering the book I was writing, referring to my serial novel, The Blue Prince. Given that there aren't any sex scenes in my book, I was really confused about this for a while. But then like 2 days later, it finally hit me. The commenter was assuming that my book is gay smut simply because the two main characters are both young men.
I find that hilarious because she claimed Twilight was smut, yet is aghast anyone would call her novel smut. Even though, both are as dry as the Sahara, but I digress. Or, the Shapiro household also, but, I digress about that too. And yeah, what we watch here is Layne flipping the hell out that anyone dared ship her characters. But Layne's repulsed that the works were found to be gay, because this is a thing that offends Layne and she didn't intend, therefore BL bad. Am I right?
A very alarming majority of these works have strange dynamics. The more dominant masculine character tends to be older or at least larger, often much older or much larger, and also tends to lack any sense of consent or boundaries. The more submissive character is often younger, or in the comics and shows, he at least appears younger and less experienced, and sometimes doesn't even start entirely gay. Not always, but often.
Layne then argues that the tamest works she can show you are all random manga pages, and not, Yuri on Ice, one of the most widely watched BL anime of all time. In the last decade, it's certainly, at least. Or, Free, Haikyuu, Loveless, Gravitation. There's a lot of them out there. She did so much research in this, guys. Believe me, she did so much research. Also, is one of those screens Killing Stalking?
When it comes to Killing Stalking, this manhwa seems to have an infamously horrible reputation. Only recently, news of a Killing Stalking animated adaptation was announced, and it was met with some avid backlash, with people immediately jumping on the wagon of stomping this series into the ground.
That's the tame one?
Even if there isn't such a dynamic, as in the enormously popular Thai BL, Kin Porsche, the relationship often begins with sexual violence. In the case of Kin Porsche, the series and the novel, one male lead literally sexually assaulted the other while he was drugged, which led to his, gay awakening or something. I don't know. I don't really go here. Just as gay shipping fanfiction created BL in the first place and saw publishers create it as its own genre marketed specifically to women, the spread and growth of BL has caused fanfiction hunger to grow, especially for the shipping of canon straight male characters, which in turn feeds the popularity of BL, and so on in an endless loop.
Listen to how repulsed she is by the idea of BL existing, and how she conflates Naruto and Sasuke shippers with BL shows that are produced with television. She has so much conflating here, and so little actual analysis of the history and the concepts of this genre, all implying that people who want to read BL fics are disturbed.
The BL fandom tends to bring about the most intense, mentally ill, fanatical behavior from fans. Women have stalked their favorite BL actors. which suggests very overtly, if I'm being honest, that the infatuation is sexual in nature. And as is often the case with women, sexual infatuation very, very often must include a strong emotional element, which is why the story doesn't even need to be sexually explicit to satisfy a female fan's emotional needs.
She can't even compliment works like The Untamed without calling it bad.
This is why Chinese titles like The Untamed have a frankly disturbingly enormous fanatical following. The original novel, The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, was written as a BL, with the author later providing wildly explicit, often disturbing scenes that sometimes featured underage characters. It was so popular that China produced a live-action drama. I've seen the live-action Chinese drama. It's a little lacking in quality, but in terms of story, it's actually quite good. The dynamic between the two characters was changed to a friendship instead of a romance.
Okay, Layne, you know why the adaptation was changed, right? Because China made it illegal to have gay characters on screen. Homosexual media is heavily censored in China.
And the change did make the story significantly less self-indulgent and allowed it to focus on the rest of the plot, which is a lot more interesting than what may or may not have been happening between these two dudes and, that sword in the bedroom.
Oh, you're praising it. You're praising the fact that the government body can censor the arts for mass distribution. You're saying that removing the gayness improved the work. That's what you're saying, right? You just said that just now, right? Let's play it again. Make sure I'm not misquoting her.
The dynamic between the two characters was changed to a friendship instead of a romance, and the change did make the story significantly less self-indulgent.
Yep, I'm right. That is what you're saying. So Layne is a fan of censorship, of government-ordained censorship to restrict gay characters from showing up. And she's acting like it's unreasonable for fans of the novel to oppose this?
However, fans of the original novel inserted their own needs into the live action, interpreting the interaction between even the actors as romantic, even when they weren't in character. Fanfiction writers in the West and the East started to write explicit smut fanfiction about the two real actors, Xiaozhan and Wang Yibo. In one case, a Chinese fanfiction writer on AO3 penned a long series that infamously culminated in Wang Yibo impregnating a much younger and obviously feminized Xiaozhan, who worked as an underage prostitute. This created such a shocked uproar in China that, among many other things, the Chinese access to AO3 was blocked. And still is as of filming this video. And it became illegal to write such works or make art about real people or about underage characters. That latter part is kind of hard to get mad about, if I'm being honest.
Layne, are you fucking crazy? While Layne's account isn't necessarily lying, it leaves a lot out.
When this story got posted very soon, Xiaozhan's what we call single fans, so basically people who claim that they only fan Xiaozhan other than any other people, the single fans of community got angry over the content, the writing, and also picturing Xiaozhan as a woman. So they started to attack the writer. And by the time it's 26, two accounts that are quite big, that are Xiaozhan's fans, started to encourage sending out posts that are kind of organized and encouraging Xiaozhan's fans to report this writer, her writing, her account on Laughter, to authorities on the basis that the writing is defamation on the actor and feminizing him, and it contains sexual content as well and all that. So that's the reason that they want to report this writer and her work.
The specific event she's talking about was used as an excuse for the Chinese government to purge their entire internet of any subversive material, which didn't just stop at stories involving underage characters, but also any LGBTQIA stories, any themes about resisting the government, anything at all that fell out of line with Chinese government's cultural standards and practices.
It's just so pointless. When you think about how this whole thing started, it's just for some really petty reasons. Okay, so I'm gonna very briefly talk about the three things that absolutely scares me about this thing. I think that is problematic. The first and the most important thing, this thing about reporting people, that actually works. If you don't like somebody's writing, you don't like what they say, you can use public authorities' rules and regulations and report them and destroy their work, destroy their haven. The people who have never done anything directly to you, just because you don't like it, and you can report it actually works. Now, that's the scary thing, the most scary thing. It really does remind you of Cultural Revolution and the 60s and 70s when families report each other, when husband report wife, when kids kill their parents. Now it's just in the digital age and happening between total strangers.
She's all for China banning the entire site of AO3, censoring the arts. And yeah, it's weird someone wrote a real fan fiction about a real person, but you're advocating for writers to have the ability to sell independently written stories. And now you're advocating that they shouldn't be able to sell their independent stories, that the art should be restricted.
This is the kind of garbage that flourishes in the minds of writers who do nothing but indulge their desires and appetites and have never been told that such indulgences might not always be healthy or normal. But fanfiction is a hugely permissive community that rewards perversion disproportionately.
And what perversion is that? Gay characters existing?
It's not even remotely surprising that these things and these tastes grow and grow there. Now, this whole thing with China blocking AO3 has a million tendrils, and some of them are from the totalitarian absolute state control Communist Party side of things, yeah, and that's not great. And I have more about this whole thing on my website, but some of the Chinese outrage came more from the traditional healthy Chinese culture side of things that thought it was pretty messed up that children were being permitted ready access to wildly graphically explicit material about underage characters who were sometimes even real people.
No, Layne, let's not change the topic actually. The government is limiting the ability of people to write stories they want to write. That's the only topic here that matters. All that being said, though, if you want to move on to the fact that U.S. book bans are mostly performed by private organizations that push these policies through, we can talk about that too, because you seem to be endorsing private citizens stepping up to push for arts to be censored as well. Kind of strange you want to endorse that as well there, by the way. Especially if the issue is if one fanfiction was written and a collection of 16 million. One fanfiction caused a controversy, so over 16 million have to be censored. That's what you endorse, Layne.
And I don't think any sane person would disagree with such a sentiment. What to do about it is an entirely different matter. To start with, it would sure help if parents paid closer attention to what their children were doing online. But that's a topic for another video.
Layne, you do realize you're talking about books for adults, right? These aren't kids' books. They are books for adults, and they're being censored because some kid might pick them up? That's ridiculous. We're going to censor every adult novel now because a child might happen to read it? That's absurd. You then argue that reading BL manga turns real-life people into sexual predators.
And one can't help but wonder if this constant indulgence in these BLs and underage fanfictions with increasingly disturbing consent issues and age gaps and the underage factor is perhaps a contributing factor in the apparent uptick in sexual crimes against young teenage boys being committed by adult women. The numbers for these crimes these days are honestly very alarming. If indulging the emotional and sexual needs on the page is permissible, then eventually the idea will enter the reader's mind that it must also be desirable in some form or other in real life. One 38-year-old woman who attempted to sleep with a group of young teenage boys in a hotel while her husband was in their own room told the boys that they should be excited to be sleeping with an older woman. Sorry, Your Honor, that sounds like fanfiction brain rot to me. BL or not, people can argue all day long that, oh, it's just fiction. Oh, we know it's just a story. We're not delusional. But if the whole function of fanfiction is to satisfy the need for self-representation and to see the self in the work, then that must radiate outward. If the self that you see and are satisfied by in the work of fiction brings you intense pleasure, then you will eventually feel the desire to embody that fantasy in reality, whether it's seeking a girlfriend or boyfriend who abuses you or becoming abusive yourself.
No, really, that's what you just said. That's what you just said. You show 20 different arrests of people being perverts over the course of 10 years. And one causes an uptick, and then two, you blame reading Naruto and Sasuke ships for this? Or, Kirk and Spock ships? This is the violent video games cause violence bullshit. It's brain rot to conflate a case where a woman tried to molest 2 boys with reading BL fanfiction. This is beyond Layne's usual bullshit into dangerous disinformation. She's taking real-life crimes that she has no idea about and pinning it to fanfiction. Do you ever have the West Memphis 3 Layne or the Satanic Panic? You're trying to pull that crap on fanfiction.
On a long enough timeline, it always happens. It's worth remembering that studies have found that what we read tends to inform our opinions, our attitudes, and our behavior, especially in young people. So if a 16 or 18-year-old girl is reading fanfiction with really disturbing content that is meant to be sexually gratifying, it will have an impact of some kind on her character and her perception of the world.
And no, Layne, your studies don't prove anything. I read through them. There's not a single one there that even incorporates close to what you're talking about. But you know what? I do have a quote that defines what fanfiction does shape in the perception of its audience.
It is, of course, pretty revealing that the blindingly white male dominance of the Western literacy canon gets to reinvent classic works, but the young female and heavily queer spaces of fandom are scorned for their tastes. Marginalized voices are drawn to fan spaces for a reason. Archive of Our Own, arguably the most important site for fan work, did a census in 2014 that revealed how 80% of users polled identified as female, with more users labeling themselves as genderqueer than cis-male. The data also showed that only 38% of those asked identified as heterosexual. As Elizabeth Minkle explained in The New Statesman, my preferred explanation is the idea that the vast majority of what we watch is from the male perspective, authored, directed, and filmed by men. And mostly straight white men at that. Fanfiction gives women and other marginalized groups the chance to subvert that perspective, to fracture a story and recast it in our own way. It often feels as if there isn't much space for difference in the dominant cultural narratives. In fandom, by design, there's space for all.
The last section Layne mentions is the fanfiction writing will result in the decline of literature, but we've already talked about this already. It's the same bullshit again, different flavor. It's all built on the premise that the modern writers are all fanfiction writers, which we've already proven is not the case. It's delusional. Considering that she's still insisting that Twilight started as a Harry Potter fanfiction, we can just dismiss this. This is bullshit. She has no idea what she's talking about. This whole section is nonsense. Completely so. But her lament ultimately is this. Modern writers didn't rise up in prominence reading the classics.
The fact, as I said before, is that a huge percentage of newer popular writers, and pretty much any writer currently working to break into the industry, came up in fanfiction. That was their literary nursery. We now live in a world where the popular best-selling novelists did not come up reading great literature and studying history and philosophy and whatever else caught their interest. We live in a world where all the popular storytellers came up on a steady diet of fanfiction and critical literacy. Their literary communities were the, AO3 subreddit and Tumblr and LiveJournal and Wattpad and all those fan forums that predated AO3.
Oh, the classics. It's funny you mention this right now. There are cases where the classics are being dismissed. Something specifically I talked with Lady Emily about when I was playing the script for this. There were cases of TikToks that she and Sarah Zed found working on their fanfiction video that dismissed classics as boring, irrelevant, unimportant. And they got some pushback for it, here and there, because fanfiction is more accessible than the classics in many cases, even though classics are all public domain and you can find them for free anywhere. But the idea is you should read the classics. You should embrace the classics. And most schools encourage you to have a balance. Yes, read Shakespeare. Yes, read Hamlet. Read Jane Austen. Read the Brontes. Read Poe. Read Shelley. Read Melville, But also read outside of the classic canon. Don't just read Paradise Lost. Read Journey to the West. Don't just read Dante's Inferno. Take a look at the Tales of Genji. Don't just read Hearts of Darkness. Read Things Fall Apart. A well-rounded worldly perspective. There are numerous works of art and culture that are ignored, neglected by former classical teaching. This interview with Sarah J. Maas actually illustrates another perspective, that kids who do not enjoy reading certain books will not enjoy reading
I had just discovered fantasy books for the first time. I had loved fairy tales when I was younger, and then I kind of like stopped reading a little bit around like 7th grade. I was like too cool for it. I had this amazing teacher in 7th grade who called my parents in for a conference and was like, look, you know, Sarah's not the worst student in our class. She's not the best, but she's not reading anymore and she should be reading. And if she doesn't like the books that we're reading in class, just take her to the bookstore, let her wander around, let her pick something out. Don't judge, don't say anything, just buy the books for her. And so my parents did. They brought me to the bookstore and I picked out three fantasy novels. I like walked out of the store with those and devoured them, and it just woke something up in my brain. And I not only loved reading them, I realized I wanted to write.
It is better for them to read something they enjoy to read than be forced to read some stuffy old novel they're not a fan of. Though Layne dismisses modern pedagogy, it's very important that kids read. If they don't read something they like, they won't develop the skill and they'll never get to those classics Layne loves so much. But that's the thing, isn't it? Because Layne's ultimate fear is not necessarily that we're neglecting the classics, but we're neglecting the European classics. Fanfiction provides a new outlet for different people to create works who would not normally have a seat at the table. It's a launching pad for writers to train and develop their skills with an audience that is responsive and can offer feedback. Something I've neglected up to this point to mention, fanfiction writers are die-hard. Have you seen the author notes on fanfiction? These people go through hell and high water to produce regular content on a weekly schedule, or a daily schedule in some cases, and some of their reasons why they delayed chapters are absurd.
Again, I apologize for taking so long to update. My country is in the brink of a civil war, so you can suppose how stressful that's been. Self-baited, I'm rushing to get this entire thing posted before I lose power in the hurricane, so please, if you find any mistakes, let me know. I'll fix them when power returns, if we lose it, which seems likely. Hey guys, sorry for the late update. I actually ended up in the ER and had to go through the rabies vaccine treatment. It sucked. Still gonna at stray cats though. Sorry for any typos. I'm bad at that and also on a lot of meds.
We're talking about people who get nothing in return, no money in return for this. They're not getting paid, they're just producing the art that means a lot to them. Come hell or high water, in some cases, literally. Who are you, Layne, to tell them that they're not real writers, that what they produce is not real art? Who are you, Layne, to tell people that their various viewpoints that they're trying to show to you are somehow wrong? Who are you to say that it's a mirror when they write about themselves, but a door when you want to read exclusively about people like you? Hilary Layne is bad for writing. She is bad for the critical community, and I'm glad to say that more people are talking about it. Her work is toxic. Her work spreads misinformation. Her work encourages government censorship. Her work dismisses the art all around her because she refuses to understand it or engage with it. And even the work she does engage with, she fails to understand. She is a grifter. She is not a critic. She is not a writer. She is barely even a YouTuber. She is nothing more than a cultural grifter, and I hope that more people see the tools she's using to pull the wool over your eyes.
And I have long ebony black hair. That's how I got my name. With purple streaks and red tips that reaches my mid-back and icy blue eyes like limpid tears. And a lot of people tell me I look like Amy Lee. Author's note. This is already in the author's note.